Well, this audience is not even awake to that. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Much better, much better. That's great. Welcome to the College of Nanoscale Science and Engineering. And for those of you that were here in yesterday's meeting, this might sound like a repeat, but I'll just say it again. The College of Nanoscale Science and Engineering has been around for about 10 years. Just a brief introduction. It's a brand new college. We have degrees in nanoscience and nanoengineering and nanoeconomics for students. At the same time, we build public-private partnerships. And we have actually grown quite exponentially over the last 10 years, from 50 people back in 2000 to over 2,800 people today. And this is now looked at as the model for public-private partnerships in terms of how to do everything from university-based research to pilot-scale manufacturing to large-scale manufacturing and building the ecosystem around specific technology thrusts. And we have become, the capital region and New York State has become the center of high tech as it relates to nanotechnology and semiconductor-based technologies worldwide. And we are recognized as that. And this is thanks to our governor, Andrew Cuomo, who has actually supported the initiative here. We also had President Barack Obama visit us several months ago, 2 or 3 months ago. So if you came in through the main entrance, you might have seen some of the pictures of their visit. So again, that is testimony to the kind of partnerships and the collaborations that we have developed over the years. And we look at a similar kind of arrangement moving forward and doing the same kind of thing in both in the storage areas such as batteries. So we had a big conference yesterday on batteries, as well as today on fuel cells. So we have also in the past hosted and been part of the New York Fuel Cell Network, which, you know, there's a lot of familiar faces here, including Matt Frank, who was actually the chair of the New York Fuel Cell Network that was created back in 2003, 2004, something like that. And then interest had waned over the years, but I think there's a lot of interest in fuel cells coming back. And so we're excited that you were able to join us today. And before we start with the program, I do want to also very quickly introduce our co-hosts. The first one being NYSERDA, who's been a major supporter of us in this area as well. So I'd like to get Mark Torpy from NYSERDA to maybe come and say a few words and introduce him. And welcome you guys.
Thanks very much. Appreciate the opportunity to represent NYSERDA here today. And NYSERDA is a public benefit corporation, and we have done a lot of work in the hydrogen area, working with companies like MTI, Plug Power, NRG, H2 Pump, a number of great companies in the area. In fact, I remember when I first came to work in this area, I worked for Plug Power back in 2000. And I must say that when I look at, when I first started, technology was really a natural gas reformed fuel cell to power your home. And to see now where the traction has gained, foothold for the applications in the forklift area is really something that has been phenomenal. I've never in a million years would have sort of predicted that, shifting in that movement. And so it's been kind of exciting to see Plug really gain some recognition. Also, if you look at sort of back in the 2000 time period to where we are today, relative to natural gas, it's been incredible to see the improvement in the technology, and in terms of drilling technology and the shale production, costs have come down significantly. So you've had this sort of changing landscape on both the technology side as well as the fuel side. And I think the one thing that really hasn't changed, and what I've seen as being fairly consistent throughout the years, is the auto folks really digging in and trying to drive down the cost of fuel cell technology. They've had a long-term view, and they've really made some significant headway in reducing platinum loadings and really bringing out the cost for the system. So I'm very encouraged to see how this moves forward. And what's really interesting about this particular event is seeing the auto folks as well as the fuel suppliers here together working on a solution to move the hydrogen economy forward and really try to find place for fuel cell vehicles and hydrogen economy here in New York. To date, NYSERDA has really taken kind of an all fuels technology neutral approach in terms of our investments. We have provided some funding for CNG facilities, ethanol, biodiesel, looking at electric vehicles, plug-in hybrids. We really have done very little to date in the hydrogen space, and we really are looking to change that. If you look at where our money comes from, it's actually a surcharge on the electric bill. So it's been very difficult for us to take those funds and use them in the transportation space. But I do see some opportunities now with DOE and a changing of their position to some extent with respect to hydrogen, and an opportunity for us to really partner with them and move forward in this area. And the gentleman, I think, who's really been championing this, trying to get a real project done here in New York in terms of our hydrogen highway, is Assemblyman Joe Morelli. He's done a phenomenal job trying to pull this together and pull together a real project. And so what I'd like to do is at least introduce Joe, have him come up here, New York State Assemblyman for the Rochester area. GM Fuel Cell, the R&D Center, is within his territory. And Joe's just done phenomenal work in trying to pull together a great project, and I look forward to the event today. So give a hand for Joe.
Before we get Assemblyman, he's our distinguished keynote speaker for today. Before we get him, I also do want to introduce our third partner in crime for co-hosting this event, Joel Reinbold. Could you quickly come and introduce?
Thanks, Pradeep. Thanks, everyone, for coming here. I'm with the NEESC, the Northeast Electrochemical Storage Cluster, and we're pleased to be working with our partners from a number of the states here. Charlie Myers from Massachusetts, and Rick Smith is someone here from Maine, and of course Pradeep from New York, and our other partners in the state. Our vision is to bring together our partners from each of the 8 state regions, from New Jersey to Maine, and to facilitate this industry for both stationary and transportation applications with hydrogen and fuel cell technology. Ultra clean, efficient, and moreover providing us with opportunities for job retention and job creation, domestic jobs using domestic fuels. So we're pleased to work with all our partners, with our colleagues from New York to not only build out this infrastructure in New York, but throughout the region. And I look forward to hearing from each of you today, and look forward to having a bright, productive future. Thanks very much.
Okay, it is indeed a great pleasure for me to introduce Assemblyman Joe Morelli from the Rochester area to give the keynote speech here. Just a few words about Joe. Some of you don't know him. Assemblyman Joe Morelli, since his election to the New York State Assembly back in 1990, he has authored more than 200 laws and established himself as a leader on the issues that matter most to the people of upstate New York. Joe is particularly recognized for his efforts to improve New York's business climate. In the Assembly, he chairs the Standing Committee on Insurance and is a member of the powerful Rules and Ways and Means committees. He also holds assignments on the Standing Committees for Economic Development, which is an important one for this group right here, Job Creation, another very important one, Commerce and Industry, and Higher Education. His career in the Assembly is the latest phase in a long history of public service. And most importantly, he's a major proponent and supporter of fuel cells in the hydrogen economy. Assemblyman Morelli.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Yeah, if you're in politics, you say good morning, everybody else says good morning back. That's how it works. So are there any other politicians in the room? I feel really intimidated, I'm not going to lie. I rarely am in a room of engineers and scientists, although I have several confessions to make. First of all, we have one committee in the Assembly called Economic Development, Job Creation, and Commerce and Industry. It's a long title, but it always makes it sound like there's a lot of different committees. It's just one, and I am a member of it. And one of the things that I did when I first came to Albany many years ago is I asked for 2 assignments. One is on the Economic Development Committee and one is on the Higher Education Committee. And I was blessed to be given assignments on both. And part of the reason is because I felt very strongly back then, and being at a place like the Nanotech Center, which oddly enough, we call it the Nanotech Center in New York. It's sort of our jargon, but it's not anywhere in the actual title of the facility. But we made a significant investment here because we recognized, and I recognized back many years ago, that the real power in job creation in this century is going to be the merger of higher education, research, academia, and industry. So being here today is a little intimidating. I'm also going to, the other confession I've got to make is that although I know virtually nothing, that's the joy of being in politics, you don't have to know anything. When I was a kid, I'm sort of like a closet science fan, I should say. Not that I know anything about it, but I recently took a week's vacation with my wife, and someone asked me, did you do any reading while you were there? And I said, well, actually, I read The Grand Design by Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow. And they said, what's that about? I said, well, it's about M theory and the creation of the universe and multiple universes and 11 dimensions, none of which I really understand. But I did read the book. And you can see that like the eyes glaze over. And I said, well, I also read a book about James Bond, if that helps. And so I didn't feel quite as... But I just want to tell, if I can, a few minutes. And I want to thank Pradeep for the invitation to be here. I sort of called up when I heard this was being convened and asked if I could come and participate, or at least be an observer, and they were kind enough to give me a few minutes here to talk about what we've been doing in New York and what we hope to do, what I hope to do. And the story really begins, my friend Matt Frank over here, who's really my inspiration in all this, several years ago invited me to the General Motors fuel cell research facility, which is located just outside of Rochester in my hometown. And this was several years ago, and I remember as I said, I'm sort of a closet science fan. When I was about 10 years old, I remember watching for hours and hours the astronauts of the Apollo missions. You know, not just when they'd step on the moon, but I'd watch when they talk about things that... And my mother would walk by, I was about 11 at the time, and probably thought, boy, I have the strangest child ever who's watching this. But I was always fascinated. It was the first time I ever heard of fuel cells on those missions. And I think to myself, and they'd say, you know, they drink the water that is one of the byproducts of the creation of energy. And you know, when you're 11, you thought, well, it must taste like battery acid or something. I couldn't get it in my head. But then when I went and visited with Matt and all the great scientists out in Honeoye Falls, I began to understand the power of what we're talking about here. And again, I don't know very much. When I start to say to people, well, you know, we disassociate electrons and protons, is that right, Matt? Disassociate when it goes through a membrane and you create energy. Again, if you can get them to not have their eyes glaze over, I sound like I actually know something, but actually that's about all I know. Except what I do know is this. This would be great for the Northeast part of the United States. It would be great for America. It would be great for the world. And one of the reasons I'm so passionate about it is because there hasn't been a lot of conversation, at least in New York, up until the last few years, about how to really take this and make it a reality. In fact, many people you talk to, when you talk about this, I don't know what your experience is, you all work in this, but my experience when I talk to lay people, they make it sound as though that'll be great someday in the future when they perfect it. And I say to people, this isn't science fiction, this is science fact. It happens now. There are vehicles all around the country, but we have problems. So here's what I'm trying to do. And I do want to acknowledge my good friends who work with the New York State Assembly who are here because they never get any attention. They do all the work. Janet Metz and Deborah Jenkins and Nicole Malik who work with me, and we've been trying to push this agenda. So this is what I'm doing in terms of talking to other policymakers, legislators, people in the governor's office, is to try to create a vision for what this can offer society, both in terms of, well, in several ways. Obviously, we're all very, very concerned about the use of energy, what types of sources of energy will be available, how to move away from dependence on domestic or on imported oil and petroleum products, how to make sure that we take care of the environment in terms of reducing the carbon emissions and our carbon footprint. How do we create jobs? How do we create energy around a cluster of jobs? And this, in my mind, meets all of those criteria. So this is what we've really done over the last few years, is we've organized at various times meetings with legislators to walk them through the potential here. And I know the great challenge for us, I think, is how to build the infrastructure, the fueling infrastructure, so that the automakers who are way ahead of us in this can mass produce vehicles and have them sold in New York and the Northeast. And so what we have done, and I've been blessed to work with a whole host of very, very talented people, Matt Frog, the automakers, hydrogen producers, NYSERDA, Brookhaven Labs have participated. We've had a lot of people involved in the conversation. And the question is, how do we do something that wasn't done when the internal combustion engine was created, which is they had a fuel supply already. So they didn't have to work at building that fuel supply, and yet that's something that we're going to have to do. And we can partner both public and private together to create the infrastructure. And so we've submitted, and actually I've talked a number of times to people in the governor's office about promoting this as an agenda item, an east-west, north-south axis that would have fueling stations not only along our interstate highway system, but begin to build clusters. Someone used a phrase, it's the first time I had heard it, which is, I think, called fueling anxiety, which I had never heard. I don't know if that's a real term, but someone used it, and I thought it was interesting. So are you going to buy a car that shows real promise in terms of doing all the things, not only its potential to be helpful to the environment, to the energy, which the average consumer probably cares about, but maybe not enough to buy a vehicle, particularly when they have anxiety about where am I going to fuel this vehicle? So what's the range of the vehicle? What's the maintenance cost of this vehicle? This is a completely different kind of a thing. And the great thing is to be able to say it probably has lower maintenance costs, substantially lower maintenance costs. You don't have to get your oil changed. You don't have to be like me who goes, oh wow, it's been 5,000 miles since I put new oil in my car. So you rush out. This is perfect for me because it's kind of idiot-proof, which is really what I need in a vehicle. And so the question is, how do we develop that? In time, the private sector will, if there's obviously adequate supply and demand, is going to build fueling stations. The question is, how do we get this off the ground? So we've put together some really smart people, and I have very little to do with it, although my name's on the paper, but a white paper asking the state legislature and the governor to invest $50 million over about a 7-year period of time to build the infrastructure, to start with clusters in a handful of cities, connect them to the interstate system. Now the beauty of this is that, in my view, this part of the nation, and certainly New York, which is my primary concern as a state legislator, is to make sure that we continue to have investment in research and development, not only for transportation projects, but there are a lot of people here involved in stationary energy applications. So research and development, which we see from being here, is an amazing and important part of the vibrancy of any community, any state, and the ability to attract scientists to continue to work on future generations of fuel cell development and deployment, but also the jobs that will come, hopefully, from the assembly and the construction of fuel cells here in our region. People may not think it's science fact, but it is, and one of the challenges that I have as a policymaker is to convince people who aren't that familiar with this technology and what we have, to convince them this is the right thing to do. And one of the things that I'd encourage all of you to do, because I'm sure you talk to each other a lot, but we need to make sure that people are talking to everyone. Talk to your neighbors, talk to people in positions to have influence, be able to communicate with people in the publishing industry, whether it's newspapers or blogs, etc. This is something that we're on the brink here, in my view. New York is already, I think, third in the nation in terms of number of fuel cell vehicles on our roads, and third in terms of filling stations, fueling stations. But we need to be number one, and that's sort of my passion in life. I don't know much about how this all works, the technology. I just know one of the things I do know is I know a good thing when I see it, and this is a great thing, and this can change the way we all think about transportation, can change the way we think about our communities, and it can really portend for New York and this region an amazing economic future. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm going to continue my work, and I'm looking forward to continuing to work with all of you to make this a reality. And I do want to thank Pradeep for the invitation to be here, Matt Frank for his friendship and all of his support and leadership, and all of you who have participated in the group that we pulled together from time to time to talk about how to lead the way. And even if this takes a little time, this is well worth the journey, and I appreciate very much all of your hard work. And I know the day is going to come in the very near future where we're going to see a revolution in transportation, and it will have started with people in this room. So thanks so much for the invitation to be here, and continued good luck.
We can take a couple of questions for Assemblyman, if anybody is interested?
I'll tell you the two questions I usually get when I go to see third graders is how old am I and how much money do I make? So I'm hoping that doesn't happen here.
Those two questions, yes. Go ahead.
Yeah, Mike backing up with Mindy. What's the sentiment with your colleagues in the Assembly?
You know, I have found that members of the legislature, again, this is sort of technology that I don't think as many people know about as we might think. It's been around for a while, obviously, and there's been a lot of work devoted to it. But this is generally still an educational process, and a lot of good people remember about a year ago we brought a number of different manufacturers brought vehicles to Albany. We had legislators come by and drive them so they could, you know, understand that this is real. This isn't some again, some technology that's years off. So I think we're making progress in that regard. You know, the thing about legislators, I always like to say is we're usually generalists. We're not experts in anything, and there are a lot of things that come at you. But in this space, I think we're beginning to really have traction. And in my mind, however, the big challenge is making sure that we get in front of Governor Cuomo and the other governors of the states, because they can really, when they're advancing their agendas, they can really put this at the top of their agenda on energy. Then it really gets some power. So I'm spending a lot of time now not so much dealing with my colleagues in the legislature, although that will come, but really trying to persuade people in the governor's office. His deputy secretary of energy has been very good and offered us a couple of opportunities to come in and talk about our ideas. So I've talked a lot to the governor's staff to try to get this on his agenda. My continued hope is that when he issues his State of the State message in January, that I can get some mention of hydrogen fuel cell deployment in that message, because I think that will help galvanize it.
There was one more question. Paul, did you have a question?
Oh, no, the Assemblyman just answered it.
Okay. One more question. Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
You mentioned in your introduction New Jersey, and I
did? Geez, did I say anything bad about them?
I know that, are they still supportive of this? Because the governor seems to be hot and cold on renewable.
No, I actually would make no claim as to anything that's going on in New Jersey. I'm sorry if I mentioned that. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to offend anybody. No, I think, you know, my guess is that New Jersey, Connecticut, New York, Massachusetts, all the states in the region, that it will take the leadership of the governors in each of those states. And what would really be great, I mean, I think, you know, what would be the ultimate home run would be if we could get those governors to come together and announce some kind of multi-state regional initiative. That's where I think you'd have real power. I mean, because that's then begins to be of such a critical mass that, frankly, I assume the manufacturers are going to sell vehicles wherever there's fueling stations, right? So they're sort of agnostic on the question of where it's sold. It's our job to make sure that we have an environmental landscape that allows them to sell them here and to attract then, you know, the research dollars and the other things that will go along with creating what Porter calls that sort of cluster, economic development cluster. That's really my hope, is that we create a cluster in this corridor and become the Michigan of the 21st century.
Okay, we'll move on. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks,
Okay, our next speaker is from the Department of Energy. Actually, Sunita missed her flight, from what I understand, but we have a pretty good replacement to replace Sunita, and probably a much better speaker too, if I'm not mistaken. We have Greg Moreland, who's going to sit in and give Sunita's talk about the federal government and the Department of Energy and what they're doing in this space right now. Greg is currently employed at Centech, a clean energy and energy efficiency consulting company, where he is responsible for providing support to the U.S. Department of Energy hydrogen program's market transformation of fuel cells and hydrogen infrastructure. He has substantial experience with implementing strategies to commercialize advanced energy technology products, as well as substantial experience in promoting policies and programs at the federal, state, and local government levels involving the environment and emission standards. Greg also has experience in developing educational programs and codes and standards supporting new energy technologies. His career features 30-plus years of experience in external relations, financial management, program, project management, and M&A with Ford Motor Company, MTI Microfuel Cells, and Centech. He serves or has served on the boards of the New York State Workforce Investment Board, New Energy New York, and the U.S. Fuel Cell Council. Right.
Pradeep didn't add in my biography is that I failed at retirement. Failed horribly at retirement. But after a few months of, the only satisfaction getting was beating Pradeep at golf, I got a call from the U.S. Department of Energy asking if I could help them with fuel cells, and I was thinking of public service at the time and said I'd gladly do it. I'm honored and privileged that you would ask me, and since that time I've been helping Sunita in the Fuel Cell Technologies program and having a lot of fun doing it, working with great people. And before I say any more, I want to acknowledge a couple people in the audience who work very closely with the Department of Energy, and that's Mike Penna and Mark Mullane at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. A lot of the research that's been done in our demonstration programs involve the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. They know so much more about hydrogen infrastructure and fuel cell vehicles than I'll ever hope to learn, and they're just in a very good position. I've been with them in other states and seeing what they can bring to the party in terms of those state efforts in doing hydrogen and fuel cells. So I'm very happy to sit in for Sunita. I would like to add that she is going to come. She will get on the next flight out of BWI to Albany, and she'll be here in time to do the Q&A. So save your questions for somebody who is a true federal employee and not a contractor like me. But I will set the table up for her very nicely. Let's see here. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Thank you.
Very concise.
This is it?
That's it. Yeah, just use it from there.
It's under window, full screen.
Do what now?
This is too small, you can't see it.
Full screen mode.
Full screen, there we go.
I do want to start out with a gee whiz slide. Gee whiz, I didn't know that. Well, and this is it. There have been 1,000 patents in last year involving fuel cells. That's twice as many, as you can see on the chart, as the next renewable energy slide, solar. Also looking at the chart on the right, U.S. has a worldwide lead with nearly half the patents over the past decade. More patents in fuel cells than any other renewable technology, and you can see that in the chart on the left. There's also been significant growth in terms of commercial deployments. The fuel, especially in a very down economy across the world, the fuel cell market is growing tremendously. As these charts show, the fuel cells shipped more than 20,000 units in 2011. That's a 35% increase over 2010. What's also interesting, if you look at the chart on the top in the red slide, the red bars, it's the Japan market. Japan's shown a lot of growth in stationary fuel cells, and these are primarily small combined heat and power fuel cells used in residences. But we've also done a lot of studies, both the DOE and regionally. There have been studies in terms of jobs impact, and the charts on the bottom show what the widespread deployment of fuel cells could mean in terms of U.S. jobs, 180,000 by 2020, and also what it means in terms of the economy and growth. Joe said in his statement that he believes that fuel cells are on the brink. I think this slide shows just to what extent they are. The DOE happens to work very closely with other countries doing fuel cell projects. And this has a fuel cell vehicle focus for the most part. It's not touching on all the markets. It's just looking at fuel cell vehicles. And from the DOE's collaboration, we know quite well how much money is being spent in other markets to develop a commercial infrastructure for fuel cell vehicle and who the leaders are. I'm not going to dwell on the programs, but if you do want to show the bar on the lower right-hand side, and those are projections of fuel cell vehicle sales worldwide by 2020, and there you're going to the 400,000 vehicle mark for that. So, Joe, we are on the brink in terms of fuel cell vehicles. I think it's even more of an eye-opener in terms of stationary fuel cell power where we are today. This is an optic or graphic on the Fuel Cell Technologies program. Oops, sorry, went too fast. Okay. Here we go. Okay. I didn't like this slide that much anyway, but this is a graphic on the Fuel Cell Technologies program. So, basically, the sub-programs within the group, I think the message here is that federal budgets are extremely tight. However, the program continues to be funded. There are right now nearly 300 projects currently funded. These are generally 50-50 demonstrations, with the U.S. government putting in 50% and the private sector putting in 50%. There's also activities at the national labs, universities and institutes. The Department of Energy has spent more than $1 billion on funds toward fuel cell technologies from fiscal year 2007 to fiscal year 2011. And the funding has had an impact. DOE funding has led to 65 patents, 35 commercial technologies, and 65 emerging technologies. These charts here show the accelerating commercialization. What's not on here and has been used in other presentations, and I think it's really appropriate here, is the impact of the DOE investment on the material handling equipment fuel cell industry, using market transformation projects, which is basically the Department of Energy giving money to other federal agencies to buy and use fuel cells, in this case primarily the Department of Defense. There was also the Recovery Act funding. Many projects were funded by the Recovery Act, and from those projects there were nearly 400 fuel cells deployed. Taking the federal government agency projects, close to 500 fuel cells were deployed. Since we did those projects, more than 3,500 fuel cells have been purchased with no government funding whatsoever, except for the Energy Investment Tax Credit. And I think has really helped get the fuel cell material handling equipment industry going. We also learned a lot from that, both in terms of what fuel cells can do for motive power and also what the implications on hydrogen infrastructure are. And I think a lot of the learnings are being funneled through the activities of the DOE that are going on right now. As far as the current status of hydrogen infrastructure, there are over 9 million metric tons of hydrogen produced each year. There's over 1,200 miles of hydrogen pipelines in use, primarily in California, Texas, Louisiana. Hydrogen's primarily delivered via liquid tank truck and gas tube trailer, and there are more than 50 fueling stations currently active in the U.S. The Department of Energy does have a near-term strategy on hydrogen infrastructure. There's quite a focus on natural gas. I know the gentleman from NYSERDA mentioned their focus on natural gas. Well, there's also quite a focus in looking at the potential for natural gas to be reformed into hydrogen, both from a distributed generation standpoint and also in terms of a wider distribution channel. But the Hydrogen Technical Advisory Subcommittee, which reports directly to Secretary Chu, is right now going through a review to provide the Department of Energy with recommendations on the most efficient pathways for hydrogen. And that review should be done within the year, I believe. But here you see graphics on different sources of hydrogen and also where it's used. There are two main options for delivering hydrogen. You can have hydrogen delivered from a central site. The department's studying that in a lot of depth and looking at different pathways. One thing we are learning from the fuel cell demonstrations is that hydrogen cost is very sensitive to volume. So the more hydrogen being consumed at a certain site, the cost will go down. And there's also more potential for cost savings at even higher volumes through distributed generation, which is basically reforming the hydrogen right there from natural gas or using electrolysis to do it. So we're looking at all sorts of pathways that are pretty exciting in terms of using natural gas or biogas. And the biogas would also include wastewater and landfills. One project we're working on right now in South Carolina is taking at the BMW assembly plant is to take the landfill gas, which they already use to provide electricity for the plant, to see if we can take that landfill gas, purify it to the extent that you can reform hydrogen and use it to fuel the fuel cell forklift fleet that BMW has at the site. And BMW right now has roughly 100 fuel cell forklifts at the site. Linde is providing the hydrogen for that facility. But they're right now looking at the potential for their landfill gas source to be the fuel for producing hydrogen for their fuel cell vehicles. We should know in a year to what extent that's economically viable. And BMW has as many as 400 forklifts at that site. So it would be a very huge site for fuel cell forklifts once they convert everything to fuel cells. Other projects that have been underway or completed, the world's largest single fuel cell vehicle hydrogen demonstration was conducted by the Department of Energy. It's close to closing, but in that project, the DOE demonstrated 180 fuel cell vehicles, 25 hydrogen stations. These vehicles traveled nearly 3.6 million miles. 500,000 trips, more than 150,000 kilograms of hydrogen were produced or dispensed in this program, with more than 30,000 refuelings. The National Renewable Energy Lab has analyzed all the data from that and continues to develop reports from it. The other project worth noting is in the lower right-hand side is that the Department of Energy is presently demonstrating the world's first trigeneration station. And what we're doing there is basically taking a wastewater biogas that the Orange County Sanitation District in Fountain Valley, California, is already using to provide combined heat and power at the site. But there's enough hydrogen content in the gas stream that working with Fuel Cell Energy, and I see Pinakin's here, Pinakin Patel from Fuel Cell Energy is here, and also with their products, they're taking the a second sip at the pool, so to speak, and from the waste gas stream, they're pulling enough hydrogen from that to fuel more than 50 vehicles a day are being fueled with hydrogen from that wastewater gas stream. And see a lot of potential in biogas from wastewater treatment plants or landfills once you get past the purification. There are technical challenges, primarily purification, which translate into cost challenges, but if we can get the cost of biomethane down to a point, it can be an extremely valuable fuel source for hydrogen. There are many regional programs underway. Here are some states that are highlighted, and this meeting today is really part of a regional program, thanks to Joel Reinbold and Matt Pronk's efforts, putting the focus in New York. But we also have activities, or I should say the DOE is working very closely with activities in Hawaii, in California. South Carolina is not posted here, but there's a lot of DOE interaction with the state of South Carolina, primarily involving motive power products. I mentioned earlier that we see a lot of potential in biogas. The DOE and NREL held a workshop at NREL earlier this year to look at the potential of fuel cells and biogas from landfills or wastewater treatment plants to use the biogas from those sites, and also industrial sites. There's a lot of potential with food processing, food waste, also farms and animal waste, but there's just a lot of untapped potential here to turn biogas, which is mostly flared, not used, and turned into a productive feedstock for either energy or as a fuel for biofuels. And the DOE will be posting the minutes from this workshop within the month, and there is a lot of work going on with the DOE biomass program, with the EPA, and with other offices in terms of seeing to what extent we can develop biogas and fuel cells. And these charts here just show you in colors where the biggest potential is, and you can see the Northeast can be pretty rich in terms of taking advantage of the biogas streams at landfills and wastewater treatment plants, and also food processors. There's a lot of organic, high concentration of organic materials in food waste. And I really see that as an untapped source. There's been a lot of focus on safety codes and standards, and probably needs more discussion than what it gets. But I think that's a very good fit for government involvement. And since 2005, the Department of Energy has had a lot of focus on safety codes and standards. And it's not just here; it's also collaboration with other parts of the world in terms of developing the hydrogen fueling infrastructure in the vehicles. In reaching toward a commonality of parts and components, much like what the battery industry has gone through in terms of standardizing processes and componentry. That also needs to be done with hydrogen and fuel cells, so that the dispensing is every bit as safe as an experience as what we're getting from gasoline today. I mentioned earlier the collaborations. It's also very important, but the DOE continues to fund regional efforts at certain states, and this chart just shows the fruits of what's being done. There have been a lot of roadmaps, and Joel has been the author of a lot of good source information from the roadmaps for each of the states here. And all the states in the Northeast have a roadmap now in terms of how to develop a fuel cell and hydrogen infrastructure, and there's also been one done for California. And I think Hawaii is also on there as well. Another area is funding. The Department of Energy announced earlier this year some awards for technology validation. And this is hydrogen infrastructure development at 5 stations. The DOE has funded more than $2 million in 50-50 cost share to develop stations with a combined capacity of over 400 kilograms a day. There you see the awards listed for topic 1 and topic 2. Not shown here was another project that was recently funded by the Vehicle Technologies Program, which works very closely with the Fuel Cell Technologies Program. $10 million of funding were recently awarded by the Vehicle Technologies Program, and in that award, and it's a 50-50, so it's a $20 million program, but within that award, there's funding for 2 projects involving fuel cell vehicles. We call them fuel cell vehicle range extenders. Joe mentioned in his speech earlier about range anxiety and also fueling anxiety. Well, one of the things that we're discovering is that you can use a fuel cell auxiliary power unit, or APU, as a range extender, working with a battery to continuously recharge the battery on board. And a few commercial products, primarily industrial vehicles, have emerged. And the technology validation program is helping with the advancement of those vehicles. These are drayage trucks. To explain the industry a little bit better, ports receive containers. The containers have to go from the ports to the customers. So there's a vehicle known as a drayage truck, which takes the container from the ship, puts it on the back of the truck bed, then heads to the rail yard, where it goes to a rail container, and then to the Midwest. The Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach have roughly 1/3 of the container traffic in the U.S. And it's also a very severe non-attainment area. Well, you can't use a battery electric truck. These are Class 8 trucks, very big, but a battery electric truck simply doesn't have the range to go from the Port of Los Angeles to the rail yard. However, using a fairly small fuel cell, 30 kilowatts as an APU, these battery electric trucks do have the range to go 200 miles a day and possibly 400 miles a day using a different configuration without running purely on electricity and using hydrogen. And Air Products is involved there. That happens to be close to a hydrogen pipeline. So there's looks like it's a very good value proposition for those drayage trucks. And we see just a lot of potential with industrial vehicles like that, using range extender configurations, and those projects are starting to get awarded by the Department of Energy. Communication and outreach is extremely important, and the DOE has done a lot in terms of working with industry and going to conferences that are focused on the customers. We've gone to food marketing conferences and grocery manufacturers conferences to talk about stationary fuel cells and fuel cell forklifts. We've done a lot in terms of developing the value proposition for the commercial fuel cell products. So you can go to the DOE website and see analysis on some products as just what the value proposition is. And certainly we'll talk about the environmental benefits of the products, but there's a lot of focus on showing companies just what the economic value potential is. And I think in terms of products like fuel cell forklifts and backup power, the economics are helping to drive the sales. Even with our experience with the grocery stores and stationary fuel cells, we're seeing that there is indeed a value proposition with the grocery stores and the food manufacturers using combined heat and power. And we can show anybody who's interested in understanding the value proposition, how they can save money with fuel cells, just by going to the fact sheets that the Department of Energy has developed, working closely with industry. Here's another example of all the stakeholders that we're working with. You know, my Rolodex is one of the biggest I've ever had, with all the people that I work with and other federal agencies at the states and other countries, and also working with customers, you know, of fuel cells. A lot of the communication that we're now developing is getting the voice of the customers that have used these and are proud to talk to other customers about their experience and what the potential is. And it's just amazing that just the Walmarts and the Cisco's and the AT&Ts and the Sprints, you know, that are deploying these fuel cell products are quite happy to tell their competitors just what their experience has been and where they're getting value out of the fuel cells, and we're helping to be a conduit for that experience. So Sunita will be here later if you have any questions. I you know, hope I helped you know, convey the amount of information that's in these slides, and there's a lot going on, a lot of exciting projects going on at the Department of Energy, and Joe, you know, fuel cells are on the brink. Thank you very much.
Well, let's get started. My name is Matt Frank. I'm going to facilitate the panel here. And what I'd like to do here is sort of reflect just before we get started with my esteemed colleagues here, just a little reflection on what we heard so far. So Joe gave us sort of the vision of where we could go in the future. Greg presented some information, a lot of things that the DOE was doing. And if we left right now, we think everything was fine. So I think that, and for me personally, I always remember things by story, so I want to tell you a quick story and see if you'll remember by the end of the day here. So how many of you watched the Olympics this year? Pretty much everybody. Men's and women's basketball. So the U.S. men, I'll talk just quickly about the U.S. men's basketball team. They won reasonably handily across that and won the gold medal. But if you recall, about 2 or 3 Olympics ago, they lost. And it wasn't because they didn't have the best players, or that they weren't the most athletically inclined, or that they knew the game the best. They didn't have the will to win. So if you watch this year, there was a couple of fellows on that team, named LeBron James, that really had the will to win. And right now, that's sort of the piece that's missing here, right? So individuals are going to have to step up to make this happen. We can have programs with the DOE, we can pull together the region, but individuals are going to have to help us pull this together. So I'm going to look across this group here. There's individuals in here that I'll expect over the next couple of years are going to step up and help us do this. There's all the pieces of the puzzle on the table. Our job is now to connect those. So Emily, I'm going to ask how you get back to the first sheet there.
Sure.
And what I'd like to do today is Joel, how much time do we have? We're a little bit late. If you give me a time, I'll keep that, because I'm an engineer.
Why don't we try to keep it maybe to 35 minutes-ish.
Okay, good. We can do that. So I want to have this chart up here, sort of to start the program here, right? Ticket to Ride, a regional roadmap for hydrogen infrastructure and fuel cells. So a good vision statement, and now we really have to go to executable plans, right? And so that's why these fellows are up here. These guys are representing companies from around the world, not just in the U.S., not just in New York State, but globally. And we need to hear from them what's the status of their company's programs, and what are they going to need to do to be successful. And also, I'd like all of us to hear a little bit about what's going on outside the United States, and that's sort of the structure we have for this. Is to be really informal. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves and what role they play in their company. You can see that most of them aren't scientists, which isn't bad, but they're on the engineering and execution side. So their job and their company is to make this happen, pull together things that need to happen. And then we'll ask a few questions, and we'd like you guys to come to the microphones and ask your questions as well, so we can really get a good interaction between the audience and my colleagues on the panel. So, Kevin, if I could start with you, we could just go down and introduce yourselves, and then we'll go back around again, and each of you guys can talk about what's going on, your company status, and things like that.
Okay. Can everybody hear me?
Okay, I'm Kevin Cano. I'm the National Manager of North American Business Strategy for Toyota Motor Sales USA. My title and my business cards keep changing because we keep trying to reconfigure what we're doing, how we're looking at all this technology. We're part of the corporate planning, product planning group. One of my sidekicks and cohorts is Bill Reinert, who some of you might know. He's a very laid-back, quiet individual who usually sits in the back of the room and throws bombs at things that are said about technologies, what's feasible and what's not. My main priority is to work with the North American Business Strategy Group in looking at the U.S. as a whole, looking at what we're doing in the states that we call Cal-Lev-Z states, which are the states that are basically adopted California regulations, and trying to figure out how we go forward with a sales plan, or as I call it, a compliance plan, mix the two together, but not be burdened by purely compliance, and go forward and dedicate our resources to what makes sense in the marketplace, which is a challenge because everything is led by California, and most of what California does not apply very well to your states in the Northeast. And I remember meeting Mr. Morelli for the first time a couple years ago. I think I might have been one of the first to talk about range anxiety. I've also studied the Northeast quite a bit. I lived in Massachusetts back in the early 80s when I was cutting my teeth on the retail side of Toyota. And if I remember right, weather is a little bit different here than it is in California. You have extremes. I remember picking up my wife at Logan Airport in January 1986. She had never been outside of Southern California for years living in the United States. She got off the plane, walked through the airport, and said, "What have you done to me?" And it's been about the same ever since, but we've been back in California for 12 years now. But you take a look at your weather extremes. Winter time, summertime, nor'easters. What does that do to the electric grid? Well, Connecticut saw that firsthand last year. It brings to question, what is the technology that makes sense going forward? And all of us have to be part of dedicating research and development, resources, bringing product to market, and putting it out there in a way to comply, because that really makes sense when it comes to what is best for your areas. So on that note, I'll pass it over to Dan, and we'll continue to talk about this.
Great. My name is Daniel O'Connell. I'm the General Motors Director of the Global Fuel Cell Fleet, and I'm located in Niagara Falls, New York.
Okay, apparently I'm not Bill McCall. Okay, my name is PK An from Hyundai Kia Motors in Korea. I flew from Korea yesterday afternoon to stop by New York to see how you guys are doing in this day. I'm flying to Hamburg, Germany this evening to attend the event there. And my responsibility is building the fuel cell systems, including fuel cell stack and balance of plant performance. And also I'm leading the projects of domestically and internationally, including the new projects. I'm very honored in this occasion.
It's quite a trip.
Oh yeah. Around the globe.
Yes. Good morning. My name is Steve Center. I'm the Vice President of Environmental Business Development for American Honda. And amongst my responsibilities includes our entire fleet of alternative fuel vehicles, natural gas cars, fuel cell electric vehicles, and battery electric vehicles. I'm also responsible for looking down all the different silos of the company. As you're probably familiar, Honda has many different products, including motorcycles and power equipment. And we have quite a few innovative technologies that can be applied across the different divisions, and I'm responsible for making that happen.
Thanks, gentlemen. And I'd like to follow up and make one more introduction, and you met Joel this morning, but as you see, all the gentlemen on the panel basically know each other or some connection there. This is a technology that's not going to happen by one auto OEM by themselves. I believe it's not going to happen by one city or state by themselves. And I guess, Joel, you gave me a call out of the blue a couple of months ago. It was near dinner time. My wife said, "Hey, there's a guy on the phone, Joel Reinbold. Do you know who he is?" I said, "No." He said he works on fuel cells. That's what I'll talk to him. And we had a 45-minute conversation and became kindred spirits at that time because he was trying to do this kind of thing in Connecticut. We had this thing we were working on in New York with Joe for the last 2 years. We had assembled a team of auto OEMs, hydrogen suppliers, as Joe had mentioned. And Joel was saying, we're trying to do this in Connecticut, and I got to pull a team together. I said, Joel, don't worry. We have the team. We need to figure out how to make this come together as a whole. I talked to Dan and Kevin and some of the folks from Daimler and other companies that are not here today but wanted to be. So we have the other auto OEMs involved with this as well. So it's really I'll say a consortium of OEMs that know what needs to be done. And so we have what we call the chicken and the egg, right? We have the fuel cell cars and we have the hydrogen. That's really what we're here to talk about today is what needs to happen. So the first question I like to ask the folks on the panel here to get started, and then I'd like some feedback from the group here, is what do each of you have going on in the United States here, and then also give us a little reflection of what all is going on in the rest of the world that could help us understand how all that looks from a global perspective. So, Kevin, I'll start with you and we'll run right down the line. I'll pick on Dan first next. So.
Well, we've made a number of public announcements at different auto shows with the focus around 2015 as when Toyota plans to have vehicles ready to launch for the fuel cell market. Now, of course, that means what vehicles, where, and that brings us back to what we really are here to talk about today, and that is where the infrastructure will be. So as far as where we will put the vehicles, we're working on that. There are competing markets around the world. One, of course, is our parent company's home market in Japan. That is basically led by a group called the FCCJ, which is looking at developing infrastructure in 4 primary metro markets. Germany seems to be way ahead of every market in the world as far as putting together infrastructure. And the People's Republic of California, where I live, there are a lot of efforts going on out there. Like I mentioned before, it's all related to the electric vehicle or ZEV mandate that goes way back to the early 90s when I first started in my previous government affairs role. But I think what we need to take a look at is what makes sense. And what Matt just said, and I said earlier, going back a couple of years ago, I met Joe Morelli for the first time. I said, wow, something's happening outside of California. I met Joel, looked at what Connecticut was doing. Matt and I keep talking. And going back to my sales days 25 years ago when I was in the Toyota Boston region, I said, okay, let's start looking at the Northeast because the electric vehicle requirements in the Northeast are going to be equal to or greater than the state of California. How do we start piecing that together? So going back to Matt's question, what are we doing? We have a fleet of about 100 Highlander-based fuel cell vehicles currently in use in the United States. We introduced those starting in 2009. The platform for that vehicle is primarily the first generation Highlander hybrid, gasoline-electric hybrid platform, heavily modified for fuel cell application. And most of those vehicles are in use in California, where most of the infrastructure exists or has been developed over the last few years, and it's planned. We also have a fleet of vehicles in Connecticut, and we also have a fairly large fleet of vehicles here in New York State. Beyond that, bits and pieces around the country. I'm driving one, as are many people at our sales organization campus in Southern California. Fortunately, we have a station right across the street. The experience that everybody is gaining from this is we've got a lot of different users, academia, fuel providers, fuel technology developers, some in state and local government. And everybody is looking at this with the idea that here's a technology that makes sense. It's very clean. More importantly, from a consumer point of view, at the retail level and the fleet level, fuel cell vehicles equal or match or exceed, depending on the size of the vehicle, what we learned 15 years ago since, and that is the experience that Toyota has of bringing the Prius to market. How do we replicate our Prius experience with the next technology? And range anxiety is the #1 concern with a lot of early adopters and other consumers that want to away from the Prius. Fuel cell provides that opportunity. It also provides the opportunity to replace drivetrains in large vehicles to something that will keep Joe Morelli's wife in her Tahoe Suburban. And I remember it was big, yeah. And that's something that so far I don't think any of us can do when it comes to electric vehicles or other alternatives, pure EVs or battery EVs. What is our next fleet going to be? I'm not really sure. We're doing a lot of testing, anticipating 2015. There's a lot of negotiating going on right now with our parent company as to platform size, target markets, et cetera. But I think much of that will be answered over the next year, year and a half when we really start to see infrastructure plans.
Yeah. Thanks, Kevin.
Okay, very similar to what Toyota's done. We've put our vehicles on the road, over 100 vehicles on the road in 2007. They've accumulated 2.5 million miles. We've deployed them predominantly on the East Coast, the West Coast, Hawaii, and in Germany. We currently have 30 cars running in Germany. We have 16 cars running around Hawaii. The rest of the cars are distributed around. We continue to operate those vehicles. We put in filling stations in order to run our fleet in all those locations and continue to operate those stations. We continue to work on the base core fuel cell technology at our facility in Huntington Falls, where we employ nearly 400 folks working on the base technology. We also have a sister division over in Mainz-Castello, Germany. We employ nearly the same amount of folks working on the vehicle integration. We have folks in California who are also working on our power electronics at our Torrance facility. So a pretty extensive program across the corporation. We continue to move the technology closer to a production application. We're looking to get there as quickly as we can and waiting for the infrastructure to come along for the ride. So.
Thanks, Dan. Okay.
Yeah, I got a sore throat after a long trip, so I can use a microphone like this. Okay, we have been focusing on Europe, especially, as you know, while keeping interested in the United States and other areas in the world. And in Europe, probably some of you may know that they have more than 80 stations, but only less than 150 vehicles are running there now. And they have a plan to build over 50 more stations in the near future. And then I have a great expectation of the state of New York. We've been contacting with California for quite a long time after we joined the California Fuel Cell Partnership about 10 years ago. But outside California, we really haven't watching a lot of activities as far as the fuel cells go. So we have a good expectation about the activities in New York. And in Korea, we will have a presidential election in coming December, so we really haven't heard much about the plans and roadmaps recently from the government agencies, but we keep contacting with them. And then in Korea, we are running now about 100 vehicles in the capital area in one of the clusters that we call, that's in Ulsan. Ulsan is quite an interesting city, which is like the Detroit in the United States, because there's a mecca of auto industry in Korea, but also is a center of oil and gas companies, which means that we can get the hydrogen fuel at a very cheap rate. So if we don't consider logistics and the other capital costs for building pipelines, we could get the hydrogen fuel like less than $3 or so. And in Europe, we are currently running 7 vehicles, but and then we are going to attend a series of events from actually today in Norway. Our president will take a ride of our fuel cell vehicle when he meets the Norwegian leader. And also we're going to attend a series of events called EU Road Tour from September 13th till October 10th in 5 different countries, including Germany, Italy, and France, UK, and Denmark. And also we're going to join the H2 Mobility in Germany as an associate member, and also we are a member of United Kingdom H2 Mobility. So we have plenty of activities to join and attend. And one of the things that really that I am really interested in, but also I'm worried about, is the roadmaps and plans of the countries in Europe. For instance, Germany has a plan to build 400 gas stations by 2020 to digest 150,000 fuel cell vehicles. In UK has a similar plan of building 266 gas stations by 2020 for over 55,000 fuel cell vehicles. I really hope that would happen, but I sometimes feel that the outside fuel cell community, the fuel cell people are like the shepherd boy shouting wolf, wolf, wolf. And every time we approach a time frame of so-called deadline of our roadmap, like 10,000 vehicles or so, and then we postpone the project, the program again, like by 5 years or so. So we really can't do that anymore, and that's why the Hyundai Kia has been sticking with our numbers for years. So we are now capable of producing 1,000 fuel cell vehicles every year, but we really can't find a market. So that's why I was really glad to hear from Matt Funk the other day. So New York has a plan to deploy 50,000 fuel cell vehicles by 2015. So I was saying, wow. And in Europe, we will keep attending government projects, and we are almost certain that the Hyundai Kia can deploy between 200 and 300 vehicles within the next 2 years, because they are very proactive and very aggressive, as you know. And I think that's about it for now, and if I have some questions, then I may answer them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. At Honda, we're presently working to complete the development of our 3rd generation fuel cell vehicle. We currently lease to consumers the Clarity, which is our 2nd generation vehicle. It's a purpose-built vehicle. It's not a conversion. And we lease them to regular folks just like us in Southern California. Some are school teachers, guidance counselors, prosecutors, housewives, and there's a couple Hollywood people thrown in just because they're in the population too. But the challenge isn't really finding customers for the cars, because there's a good attraction for this kind of technology, or the fueling for that matter, although it's very expensive and very unproductive, because you can build a station and it may see a car every couple of days. So from the business side, it doesn't make any sense right now to either build the cars or to provide fueling. And what we're trying to do is accomplish something that's probably taken 130 or 140 years on the petrol side, and that is to have this ubiquitous fueling infrastructure, no anxiety. The last time I experienced any fueling anxiety was in the gas lines of the 1970s. So you have a very different situation, although with natural gas it's very similar. There's a lot of gas around, not a lot of fueling. I have some advice. Pick a geography and concentrate that geography with fueling. The manufacturers will concentrate that geography with the products. And then you'll have fueling stations that make economic sense to those who want to invest in them, even the governments if they're going to provide incentives for doing that, and you'll get the adoption. And then people will see that you can travel around in a certain geography with that type of car and that type of fuel, and it'll take off from there. But you don't eat an elephant in one bite, and that's what we're trying to do. We should eat the elephant a bite at a time, and we'll have a much better success. It isn't that difficult. The technology exists. I think you can see from the various presentations. It's not new technology. Automotive technology is not new, and neither is the fueling technology. So we just have to pick a territory, and you'll find it'll spread that way. You can't cover the whole country at one time.
Thanks, Steve. I'd just like to add a few things to that, and then I'd like to open up to the group here. BK referenced 50,000 vehicles in New York State, and Joe referenced a white paper that was put together. So the 50,000 vehicles is really over the time frame of 2015 to 2020, and that paper is available. If you'd like, you can go to the HTAC website, It was presented to them in the June 2011 meeting, and we can also make that available to the folks that attend here too. I can get that to Pradeep and Joel. And you can just look at basically what Steve had just talked about. How do you do this in sort of a logical, cadenced manner? And I think also, if you look at this here, it doesn't say, as we talk about, as you heard what the gentleman talked about, really the execution plans, right? So the question isn't, can I make electricity from hydrogen and air, which we asked 20 years ago. It's, how do I put gas stations in place so I can drive my car? So an entirely different question. So with that, I'd like to ask for the audience what kind of questions, and the young lady over here.
Thank you. Karen Persick from Praxair. Consumers have a choice, electric vehicles, plug-in hybrids, natural gas vehicles, and hydrogen-fueled vehicles. And auto companies have a choice of how they're going to meet the CAFE standards. Can you actually afford to provide models of all those vehicles, spare parts, repair stations, and everything on the long run, or does one have to win, one alternative technology? And how does the recent inclusion of eligibility for natural gas in the CAFE standards affect the implementation of hydrogen?
I'd like to take a shot at that. I think you can't afford not to, because you don't know which technology is going to prevail. In the case of natural gas, it's the easiest conversion for an automaker because we all have great expertise at internal combustion engines. The natural gas is readily available, and you just need to establish the fueling. Fuel cell technology is very far. None of us have any great expertise in it at this point, and we have to discover ways to make them durable and reliable to the same expectation that an internal combustion engine is. As far as supporting different existing products in the market, we all do that now. We all have many different models. So really, one part's another part. I think it's the scalability in the manufacturing, and at certain volumes it makes sense to support several different cars. But right now, you can't afford not to, and you'd be foolish to pick one, just one.
Any other guys?
I guess I could, to continue in that discussion, we look at not so much CAFE at this point, but the immediate challenge, and that is, like I said earlier, the California regulation states. And even when you look at that, because of the differences in geography, weather conditions, and more importantly, where are the people? There is no one technology that really suits. Battery technology at this time really makes more sense in a smaller battery pack, more of a urban model, with limited mileage range. But for the extended range model, natural gas or fuel cell, it makes much more sense. So at some point, maybe through consumer acceptance or rejection, down the road we get to a certain technology or technologies that make sense. In my mind, personally, this is not a Toyota point of view, I think natural gas and fuel cell are the two that continue to meet consumer needs going forward. And that's because what we learned from the Prius is that consumers do not want to adapt. Early adopters will adapt, consumers will not. So you've got to make it as seamless to the consumer, the mainstream consumer where we're looking at volumes of 150 to 200,000 plus for a model, to justify production. And that's where, EVs fall, but natural gas and hydrogen fuel cells, or whatever that configuration moves toward, is the model that makes sense.
And I think globally it will also depend on what natural resources are available to deal with that today. We have gasoline here, we have a lot of diesel over in Europe, we have LPG over in Asia and some different locations. So I think we're able to accommodate all of those based on the geography as Honda said earlier.
Another question. Peter?
Peter Hoffman from the Hydrogen Fuel Cell Center. Two questions for Toyota. One, can you say anything at this stage about the cooperation between Toyota and BMW and fuel cell development, which was announced The second one is your cohort, as you call it, Bill Reiner, made a comment the other day in the New York Times when the National Petroleum Council report came out saying, regardless of all the new technologies, it'll still be internal combustion engines decades from now as a mainstay.
Yeah, Bill says those kind of things. And we usually say, what did he say? And run for cover. Always remember, Bill is getting very close to retirement. So. He hasn't told us when, but he becomes looser and looser in his comments that he makes. But actually, that does make perfect sense. And you take a look at the technology advancements of the internal combustion engine, the cost of the vehicles, and the cost of everything we're talking about here today to the regular consumer. I go back to what does it take to justify producing a vehicle. It takes production volumes for us to produce a vehicle in North America of at least 100,000 sales a year in North America. Typical consumers cannot have more than one vehicle in many cases. So the internal combustion engine, technology advancements, the CAFE standards that are coming are going to continue to force us to make those internal combustion engines better. When Bill says those things, he's saying it because from a marketing and a sales approach point of view and customer acceptance, that makes perfect sense. But Bill always is out there challenging all of us as companies, and our company particularly, putting information out there. Bill's a scientist, he's an engineer, and he's got a lot of work with the inroad studies. But he's a very good crystal ball person, and that's why he says those things.
Because in the past, you guys, I can't remember citing any specific examples, but if you remember, Reiner saying often coming out in favor of fuel cell hydrogen technology over the years.
Yes. Yeah, and Bill is still one of the strongest advocates for fuel cell hydrogen technology. That hasn't changed. But in realistic, look at running a business, we try to tell our friends in California all the time, we need to make money to be able to do all this. And put it in perspective, it's going to be a long time before the cash generator for all of our businesses, the ICE, and the Corolla, for us, the Corolla, the Camry customer, they still are the ones generating the profits so that we can, invest millions and billions of dollars into these new technologies.
And just want to follow on with the BMW Toyota aspect. I know you can't say anything now, but can you give any idea when or when not there might be some kind of announcement or something coming up? Because the announcements in Munich and Tokyo were pretty bare, pretty barren.
Yeah. Well, we at Toyota in the U.S. usually find out what our parent company's doing by reading the Japanese newspapers. So, just like our investment in Tesla, the cooperative agreement with BMW caught a lot of us by surprise. Just taking a look at it on the surface, we don't do diesel well. Diesel, like Dan said, is what's important, in Europe. We've made a lot of advancements in our fuel cell technology, our tank production technology. I would assume those are common areas of discussion, but those will be done with BMW in Germany and with Toyota, our parent company in Japan. We won't have much involvement in that.
Good, thanks. Other questions? Gregory.
Gregory Solich, G Global Research. My question to the panel is, could you rank three major roadblocks in deployment of fuel cell vehicles?
Could you repeat the question?
Could you rank three major roadblocks in deployment of fuel cell vehicles?
Dan, would you like to take a crack?
Well, clearly infrastructure would be very important, as well as continue to go down the cost curve for the fuel cell technology itself. Those are probably, in my mind, the two big hurdles.
BK, how would you see that? I mean, you're from Korea, so you're looking at this from a different perspective than these guys that are stationed here in the U.S. You look at it from a global perspective. What do we need to do?
So do I have to pick up three of them? Okay, in general, three biggest hurdles are infrastructure, durability, and cost. And I think we can handle the cost issue because every time there is a rule of thumb in our industry such that every time you add one digit, one more zero in volume, and your cost will go down to a half. So that's why we want to increase the volume from 1,000 to 10,000 without, stopping by at 50,000 or so. I mean, 5,000 or so. And we try to reduce the cost in so many different ways. And I think this morning one of the gentlemen talked about platinum. I'm not really worried about platinum cost because we know that platinum is recyclable. So when you try that, we can recycle the platinum over 95%, and purity of that recycled platinum was over 99.99%. So I'm not quite sure if there's going to be the big hurdle, but I'm kind of worried about the cost of carbon fibers. Because when we expected the future a diagram of the cost of the future pure cell vehicles, percentage-wise, carbon fibers are the biggest. One of the reasons is that the three companies in Japan dominate the carbon fibers, and then their market share in the world is over 72%. And the other hurdle might be from the cost perspective. That's going to be the motor. And we used to use permanent magnet synchronous motor because that is more effective, and it's smaller than the AC induction motor, but cost-wise it's a little bit higher. And the other reason we switched our option from permanent magnet to induction is the rare earth material. Because we didn't run into that problem like Toyota and Honda did a couple of years ago, but with their hybrid system with the Chinese government. And if we really can't expect what's going to happen, in China, because rare earth material is Chinese government strategy material. So every time they export that material, they have to get some approval from the central government, as far as I know. So we want to avoid that kind of issue. And most importantly, I think infrastructure is going to be the biggest hurdle in the near future and long term too, because it costs a lot to build one station. And I saw the interesting data a couple of years ago from Fuel Cell Partnership in California. The good thing about fuel cell infrastructure is they surveyed the gas station owners in California whether they prefer hydrogen stations or battery recharging. But their answer is they prefer hydrogen stations because, either fuel cell vehicles or battery electrical vehicles. Because for battery electrical vehicles, basically you want to recharge your battery during the nighttime at your home. But for fuel cell vehicles, you have to go to the filling stations. And for the gas station owners, they can make a lot of profit from the convenience stores. So that's why they would prefer a hydrogen gas station to battery electrical vehicle. So from many different perspectives, I think we have to resolve the issues of hydrogen infrastructures, otherwise really can't really get there. Thank you.
Good, thanks. And I think in the interest of time, we'll take one more question. So gentlemen up here.
Since we're sitting at the College of Nanoscale Science and Engineering, where do you see, this is a little crystal ballish, but where do you see nanotechnology intersecting with the development and the adaptation of hydrogen fuel cells?
Refinement, whether it's fuel cells or solar panels used to create electricity to hydrolyze water, the productivity and efficiency of those comes from refinement in the manufacturing.
Anybody else on the panel want to comment?
Well, actually, we already are applying the nanotechnology to fuel cell systems. One is the platinum, and then in the bipolar plate, we are now making bipolar plates out of steel, stainless steel. We used to use graphite composites a long time ago. But for protection of the metallic bipolar plate, you have to coat that, and now we are using nano gold. So that is already nanoscale technology. And also for the hydrogen tanks, there are 4 different types, and now people are talking about type 5. For type 4, the liner or inner tank is made of plastic, but that's not simply a polymer, but that could be reinforced by nanoclays or other nanoscale product elements. So I can say that we probably can make more. We probably can use more nanotechnology for other components, but even now we are using nanotechnology for some of the components.
3M is working with Nanoscale on a tank, and tanks, in order to hold the kind of pressures you need for the quantity of fuel, for the range of the vehicle that consumers want, become very heavy. And the lighter, the better. You need different materials for that kind of strength.
Greg, did you want to just comment from the DOE?
Yeah, the Fuel Cell Technologies program has a goal to get the cost of fuel cell stacks for automotive applications down to $30 a stack by the 2017 period. When they started this, they were in the $300 range. Right now, it's around $50. But getting that cost curve down on a $30 a stack, and that's at high volume. So volume is out of it. This is a pure design cost challenge, but nanotechnology is contributing quite a bit and continue to do so to get those stack costs down to where the DOE target is, because that's where the DOE believes that the cars need to be competitive. So it's played a big role and will continue to do so. And also the comments in terms of fibers for storage, I think that's also an obvious area where there will be continued research and development on nanotechnology.
Okay. Thanks. I'd like to give the fellows on the panel a round of applause for this. Also, they'll be available at lunch, and I'll ask them to sit at separate tables so you guys can talk to them. We have a ride and drive a little bit later today. There's a Toyota Highlander out there, a fuel cell vehicle. There's also a Chevy Volt you can take a look at. It's a little bit different technology. Pradeep's informed me we should take a 10-minute break, so let's make it 10 minutes or less to get back in here so we get back on our program. Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody. We're going to listen to our esteemed panel on hydrogen production, infrastructure, economics, planning, and strategy. My name is Joel Reinbold. I formerly worked at the Connecticut Center for Advanced Technology, and I am the administrator for the Northeast Electrochemical Energy Storage Cluster that I mentioned very briefly this morning. Let me spend maybe 1 minute on the world according to me. Hydrogen. It is a perfect energy carrier. It is all those fuels we use today, but without the carbon, without the impurities, without the things that we don't want. It's the perfect energy carrier. It's clean, it's efficient, it's cost effective to the extent that after we make it, which we have to do for these energy carriers, we can then store it and use it when we need to meet our peak demands for both transportation applications and storage applications. Our drivers, what do we want? What does the public demand? Efficiency, cost effectiveness, cleanliness. Hydrogen provides it all. 100 years ago, we might have been asking the same question. Why do we need that other energy carrier, electricity? We've got all these mechanical things. We've got animals, we've got oils. Why do we need electricity? Well, it's the same answer here. We're moving into a new paradigm, and here is the energy carrier that is perfect. Everything that electricity has, and we can store it. I would like to test our panel on who they are, what they do, and where they're going. So very briefly, I'd like you to give a quick intro of who you are, what you do for your company, and give me a 30-second dissertation on where you want to go. We'll go through the panel, each taking 2 or 3 minutes to go through each of you, and then I will ask the audience if they have questions. And I'll move a little bit over here, and I'll be the audience for a second. I'll ask the first question, so I'll give you advance notice that the question is, you told us who you are, you've told us what you do, and you've told us where you're going. I'll ask that first question. How do we get from where you are to where you're going? What do we need to do collectively to get to where you want to be? All right, let me start with my friend and colleague, Larry Malthorpe from Proton On-Site. Larry?
Hi, everybody. Excuse my voice here. I'm fighting a little cold, but that doesn't mean you can't shake my hand. I'm Vice President of Hydrogen Systems for Proton On-Site, formerly Proton Energy Systems. I'm a co-founder in 1996. We make packaged hydrogen generators using PEM technology, and we make a profit selling them. We sell them worldwide. When we founded Proton, that was the first leg on a 4-leg business program. At the end of that was making hydrogen-based energy products. Now that was in 1996 when we founded it. When I was 6 years old, and I thought of this just this morning, I had a favorite toy. The favorite toy was this little red car, and it was an electric car. What was neat about it was that every 5 minutes, this little mechanism would shut the car off, and I'd have to go get this little toy pump and squirt a little water into it to make it go for the next 5 minutes. So now, 50 years later, I work at Proton. I have a pump that takes water and electricity, and I hook it up to a car to make it go. In this case, the car goes 350 miles. So when my daughters ask me, what do? I say, well, in some ways, it's the same thing I did when I was 6 years old. But it's a lot more fun. I drove up in a Toyota fuel cell vehicle today, and in terms of range anxiety, I had no problems at all until the last 3 miles when I got caught in a traffic jam. But the vehicle technology is here. The fueling infrastructure is quite possible with technologies we have. And where we'd like to go is to continue to reduce costs and make this fueling infrastructure cost affordable and, most importantly, deployable. Proton's most recent activity in the fueling arena has been Sun Hydro. It's a packaged, fully integrated hydrogen storage plant that could be sited anywhere. You can put a 40-foot cargo container. We've built one. We've got it operating at our facility. That's what fueled my car today, and we're now building our second one.
Thank you, Larry. Adrian Corliss, Plug Power.
Great. So I'm from Plug Power, kind of the odd person out on this panel in that we're not necessarily today an infrastructure provider, but we are actually deploying a lot of products which are associated with infrastructure. So Plug Power, first of all, I'm the Chief Technology Officer, primarily responsible for product development. But we develop, we deploy, and then importantly, we actually support hybrid fuel cell products that are deployed into off-road vehicles. And we've I've heard lots of discussion this morning about that. Primarily, it's forklifts, and so our typical customers we're looking at are either in manufacturing sectors like the auto companies, such as Mercedes-Benz or BMW we have as customers, or also in distribution. So typically, our customers operate large fleets of electric vehicles indoors. On the distribution side, what's interesting is that they're really located along the same corridors that infrastructure is required for the automobiles, for obvious reasons. And I think, in particular, thinking about the Northeast, what's interesting is the Northeast is actually a really important area for distribution in the U.S. And within the Northeast corridor, you've got nearly half the population of the U.S. that relies on distribution and relies on the movement of goods through these corridors. So we've got a lot of our customers who are currently deploying technology who have facilities and locations here. And I think there's an opportunity, again, to continue the growth of the installation of infrastructure here in the Northeast, and I think more importantly to think about that as maybe a platform to help the early deployments of fuel cell vehicles. So to put a few numbers to that, today I think as of this morning, we have roughly about 3,900 forklifts that are being operated in the U.S. at 37 sites, and we're fueling between about 15,000 to 20,000 fueling events every week. So I think that today it's probably fair to say that the fueling of material handling is probably dominating the refueling industry in North America right now. And to date, we're roughly around 8 million fueling events, representing about 10 billion kilograms to date that have been spent. So I think I'm here today to maybe put a few ideas on the table about how to utilize that capital that's already out there, and also the fact that our industry and our customer base is growing pretty rapidly. And I think if we're smart about that, we might be able to incent those customers to be party to the fuel cell infrastructure rollout as well.
Thanks, Adrian. Harry Sagan, Praxair.
Yes, hi. I'm with our Global R&D Center in the Buffalo, New York area, and I work with external outreach, evaluating new technologies, especially in the energy space, and looking at overall what's happening in energy. Praxair is one of the world's largest industrial gas companies. There's only a handful of them. 3 of them are represented on this panel. And a large hydrogen supplier in North America. We have one of our biggest plants in Niagara Falls, and that is unique in that it's carbon-free hydrogen. It's a byproduct of a chemical process, which uses hydropower, and our purification uses hydropower. So we can supply green hydrogen. Unfortunately, we deliver it with diesel-powered tractor trailers. But we do have we supply 2 hydrogen fueling stations up in the Rochester, New York area, and Assembly Member Morell's district. Where we're going, we stand ready to add additional hydrogen capacity. As you saw from the earlier DOE presentation, there is a lot of additional hydrogen capacity planned and being added, mostly for refining, to allow the use of heavier hydrocarbons in cleaner, conventional transportation fuels. If we want to talk about adding more carbon-free hydrogen capacity, then that's another story. If we were to add, it would be natural gas-based methane reforming. It's possible, and perhaps the gentleman from Air Products will talk more about carbon capture from steam methane reformers. It's possible to do that. Then we'll need to either use it for EOR or sequester it in your backyard. And we'll need natural gas to get that, and we'll probably get that perhaps by fracking. So there's no free lunch on free hydrogen, except if you're looking to a higher cost production method, or production methods to be developed, based on biogas and so forth. Right now, the big, well, let's just say that all the economics that we're talking about for stations and how many cars you need to patronize a station in order to make it worthwhile, those are all based on carbon-containing hydrogen molecules. Hydrogen molecules that were produced with a carbon footprint. So if you want to talk about the future where you don't have a hydrogen footprint for that carbon, we need to change the economics for that. And that's, I don't know, kind of where we're going a little bit, and I'll leave it there and we can talk more later.
Thanks, Karen. Mark, Milena, and Ralph.
Hi, I'm from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. It's in Golden, Colorado. We have about 2,000 people at the laboratory, but more than 2,000 that work on energy efficiency and renewable energy for Department of Energy. Within that group, our hydrogen center is about 35 people. And the slides that Greg showed earlier that show the whole portfolio of the Fuel Cell Technologies program, we mirror that in our structure, so we support the whole program. The group that I'm in is infrastructure analysis. So we do technology validation, storage, hydrogen production, renewables. Our group just does infrastructure. And we have supported roadmap efforts in other parts of the country. We're involved with the California Fuel Cell Partnership. We helped with the roadmap that Texas did a few years back. And right now we're analyzing the business case essentially for the roadmap in Hawaii. So I think something I want to emphasize is that hydrogen has been studied a lot. We know a lot about how it works. We know know a lot about the technologies, and we know a lot about the economics of providing hydrogen to vehicles. So there are uncertainties in terms of investment and market adoption, but the technologies are fairly well understood. We focus on techno-economics, how much things would cost to roll out an infrastructure in a given region. And that's a tractable problem. You can analyze it and understand it fairly well. At the same time, it needs to happen really quickly, so you can't plan for 10 years. You have to act faster. The other thing that we look at is really the social benefits of this technology. And I think something that I wanted to emphasize was that people talk about infrastructure in terms of costs as being very high. But when we do our simulations of market adoption, and you go out 20 to 30 years and see all the benefits that accrue when markets take off, those costs look really small, the upfront costs. So investment is a challenge, costs are a challenge now, but the benefits in terms of the market's viability and social benefits are very large by comparison.
Thank you, Mark. Michael Beckman, Lindy.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm running our hydrogen fueling program for North America, and I've got a team, Dave Reed, Steve Eckert, and some engineers, business development guys that some of you may have heard of. Lindy's a global industrial gases company, and we've got operations around the world. We're very active in hydrogen, specifically hydrogen fueling. We've got programs, big programs in Europe, especially in Germany, as well as here in North America. We have maybe taken a little bit of a different approach than other industrial gas companies. We've developed our own compression technology, and both on the kind of liquid pump side as well as the gaseous compression using ionic compression technology, essentially using the liquid to compress a gas, and there's some benefits in doing that. We've got 80 stations plus worldwide. Here in North America, we've done 300,000 to 400,000 fuelings. We've got stations in all the segments. Forklift trucks, you've heard a lot about that. Several times people have mentioned BMW. We provide the fueling infrastructure there, the fuel. At the BMW site, it fuels 300-400 forklift trucks, Coke, Whole Foods, Walmart. We also, on the car side, have stations not only around the world, but here in the U.S. And then on the bus side, which I haven't heard a lot about, but buses make a lot of sense, potentially, because it's a significant use of throughput right off the bat. One of the biggest challenges, of course, that we have on the infrastructure side is putting a station in that costs, I know it seems small, but $1 million or $2 million when you have 5 cars a day fueling there is not a great economic proposition. However, buses using 30 kilograms a day each times 10, 12, 50 buses, now that starts to make some sense. If you can couple that with cars, you see the picture here. So we've got the largest bus fueling station in the U.S. Out in California, and so we've done a lot in this area. We're involved in the whole value chain with hydrogen, from production through distribution and then fueling. And again, we're kind of looking at improving that cost infrastructure by developing our own technologies to then do this more cost effectively. That's in a nutshell kind of what we're doing.
Thank you, Michael. And last but not least, Gus Block, Nevada.
So I'm Gus Block. I'm Director of Marketing and Government Affairs for Nuvera, and we're a company of about 130 people located outside of Boston, and also we have an office in Milan, Italy. We were established in 2000 to commercialize hydrogen and fuel cell technologies, and we've had a number of products over the years ranging from combined heat and power systems for residential or commercial use, telecom backup systems, fuel cell engines for automobiles, and since 2005 we've been focusing quite strongly on industrial vehicles. So we've got, we're on a 3rd generation of fuel cell power systems for forklift trucks, and we also make the hydrogen refueling equipment that goes along with that. So that system is called PowerTap. It's a 50 kilogram per day system, and it's based on steam methane reforming. This is a technology that, at companies like Linde and Praxair, where you would find a huge steam methane reformers at refineries, chemical plants, has been scaled down by a couple of orders of magnitude to really what is an appliance running on natural gas and water that's located outside of a distribution center or a manufacturing facility, and which is about the right scale at 50 kilograms per day for the forklift deployments. Next year we'll be introducing a system that has compression for automotive requirements, 10,000 PSI, and then also next year there will be a fuel cell bus and a hydrogen refueling station that we're locating at Logan Airport. So we're all really looking forward to that. In 2015, we'll have, this is where we're going, we'll have our system that's about 5 times as large, 250 kilograms a day, which is about the scale required for automotive refueling.
Thanks, Gus.
Yep.
I said I was going to ask the first question, how do we get there? We've attempted to begin analyzing that question with your help, the development of our state roadmaps, with assistance from the US DOE, the Small Business Administration, each of the states, each of our state partners. We've attempted to develop lean and mean roadmaps for each of the states in the Northeast, that's New Jersey through Maine. We have begun this analytical process with an in-plan model to identify jobs and revenues. We've moved into identification of targets, including fleets, transit districts, refueling locations, and potential clusters for both vehicle deployment and hydrogen infrastructure. And last, we have identified the policy for each of those states. Alex Barton walking around the back here, take a look at him. He has copies of those roadmaps, and if you need to take, Alex, you do have those with you, right?
I do.
Yeah.
For
I'm
all
sorry?
8 states. For all 8 states.
If you want to take a look at those, see Alex, and maybe we'll find a place to put them, and they're also available online. These roadmaps are work in progress. We're looking to further develop them, but we're not developing them for ourselves. It's for you, and we need your input. So here's my first question. How do I amend these roadmaps? How do I refine them and tune them up? What are the hows? How do we get from where we are now to where we want to go? And why don't we just go right down the line here? Larry, what's your thoughts? What do we need to do?
Well, you've already been through a round of data gathering. If we looked at my personality chart, one of the things I look at is gathering data. So a good data set, representative set. One of our earlier panelists talked about interviewing station owners, finding out what's important to them, even if it is selling Twinkie bars. That's important to do. So from a data-centered post, let's take a look to see where it makes sense to place vehicles and then the infrastructure to support that. And a model that's had a lot of play in California is the cluster model. So you build out from a center and build out. And maybe there's a variety of, since I represent infrastructure, maybe there's a variety of technologies that would help support that. I'm a great believer of a rising tide floats all boats. So we don't need to be so competitive on technologies. What we do need to do is to look at what would be the best likelihood for a successful rollout in the early stage and in the mid stage, and how do we deploy those infrastructure assets to support what likely would be the early and middle road adopters of vehicles.
Thank you, Larry. Adrian, what's your thought on this?
Well, I think a couple things. The first thing I think is that I would ask that actually people remain open-minded, and I think there's some creative ways to build out the infrastructure network. And there's certainly not one approach and one answer, I think, that's going to solve all the problems. I think that we think that there's room in there for some maybe less sexy stations that might be a bit more functional. But I think ultimately you're able to connect the regions together, connect the neighborhoods, basically connect the dots of the infrastructure without costing all that much. And so when I look at a typical customer that we have today, when they install their infrastructure, they pay for what it costs from day one for the fuel that's delivered from that infrastructure. So it's not subsidized, and the way that they do it is that they actually deploy large fleets at the beginning, so they're utilizing the capital. And I think that that's really an opportunity, because if you have a location where there's the opportunity to have access to compressed hydrogen stored on site, maybe delivered outside the fence, for what they pay at 300 kilograms a day, but you're only bringing 1 to 2 vehicles in, it's just a different way to deal with that introduction phase. And certainly when you get to the point where at that location there's sufficient volume of vehicles to justify a commercial station with the chips and the energy drinks, et cetera, that's great. But I don't think that that's necessarily practical at the beginning. And the second point is I think you need to be open to who actually should be considered to be the right operators for these vehicles. And I think the other thing that's kind of interesting is that every one of these distribution sites where you've got 100 plus or 200 plus vehicles, they're running 3 shifts, so that means they have at least 600 to 800 employees at that site. And I think that they're not movie stars or rock stars, but I think that there's the opportunity to take advantage of the density of people that are actually at those sites to be early adopters as well. So there's just a couple of ideas that are a little bit different.
All right, Adrian, thanks. Karen, your thoughts?
Good. Yes, so Praxair is a for-profit, publicly traded company, and as such, we're obligated by the SEC to try to make money for our shareholders. Unlike government, which can make decisions for the greater good and, future of society. So, I have to play with the cards that are dealt to me and play within those rules. So, in absent of a carbon tax, absent of a business case to build the stations, they won't get built by for-profit companies. So business case, forklifts, captive fleet, yes, it's going forward today, a big growing area. So the government or society, other organizations can make the business case for the station. It's either got to be increase the number of vehicles that patronize it, maybe make all the government cars in Albany hydrogen vehicles. Simple, you make a rule and it happens. Or reduce the capital cost of the station to make it profitable. Like Michael said, $1 million to $2 million. If the capital cost was offset, then on an operating cost basis, you could make do with a fewer number of cars. So it's from my point of view, it's kind of simple. I have to work with what's out there as far as the market.
Karen?
All right, I guess I want to build on that a little bit and say I think that a good roadmap is really going to help reduce risk for all the people involved. And that's important for the stakeholders who are at the table providing the input, that they get that out of the roadmap and the activity. At the same time, that really has to happen with volume. The faster things get to volume, the faster the risk goes away. So to me, an important thing is to keep in mind the customer. There are important things to do with fleets. That's a key part of it. There's important interaction with forklifts and other applications. But early adopters that buy fuel cell vehicles want to be very satisfied, and market growth really depends upon that. So the consumer experience is really important for refueling. The vehicles, I think, are going to be fine, but refueling is where it has to happen.
Yeah, so on that note, just to expand down the line here, that experience is really important, and I think there's a mix of stations that have to go out there today, because you can put less expensive stations out that have throughput of 50, 100 kilograms a day, and you're probably going to be some lines behind those stations. But I think you also need to have stations that put 400 kilograms a day out that people can fuel out back to back. I think there's a gentleman from Toyota the last session that said one thing we've learned is that the consumers don't want to change, right? So the consumers with fuel cell vehicles aren't doing anything. They want to go out there, they're busy, they feed busy lives, they will fill 3 minutes, go in, get a cup of coffee, and leave, and then wait in line. So this is a focus that we've taken at NEESC to try to put high throughput stations out there today. Again, cost effectively, well, it doesn't make sense. It has to have support by government. Government's going to have to be the one to help to spur this, at least in today's market, unless there's some other need. I think the other thing that sometimes is overlooked in putting infrastructure out is really tough for a couple of reasons. There's codes and standards issues that have to be overcome. There's permitting issues. There's not in my backyard issues with municipalities that say, we love green and clean, but put it somewhere else first. And so then you have to sell the station to the local business council and the board of the city that you're putting it into, and convince the authorities having jurisdiction that can interpret code the way they want to interpret code. These are significant hurdles that should not be overlooked. So those two things, funding and then also go to the standards.
Thank you. Gus?
Yeah. Well, I think that there's a lot of great ideas, and certainly they've been around for a while in terms of synergizing with forklift deployments, fleets, buses, that kind of thing. And just to add to that, you know, we can start pretty small. You know, 50 kilograms a day systems like the ones that we and others make allow you to build up an infrastructure incrementally, and then we will need the larger stations in the 250 to 500 kilograms per day range. One interesting thing about our company is that it's owned by Hess Energy. Hess has 1,400 stations along the eastern seaboard, 95% of which are corporate owned and operated. And so that provides yet another sort of established infrastructure that we can piggyback on by locating some of these appliances at Hess stations. And Hess is very much interested in this idea for no other reason than to get people into the convenience store, because it does in fact generate a lot of business for them. So this is something that Nuvera and Hess are certainly eager to work with the consortium together. And really the key is utilization. So as long as we're getting decent utilization out of the systems that we're deploying, and that can be at a pretty small scale, as I say, then I think it's the right start, as well as the clustering approach.
Gus, thanks very much. Let me, thanks for those terrific answers and some insight into these this area of how to get to where we want to go. Let me turn to the audience and see if we can take some questions. Here we go.
Okay. So I want to go to something Mark had talked about relative to it's possible today to do hydrogen infrastructure, it's possible to do fuel cell vehicles, and then also we talked about some things that we need. So if we were to have a national energy policy, and if we have 3 states there, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, maybe some others, what would you guys like to see from those states to help launch this thing? Right? You heard from the auto OEMs that they're coming, right? 2015, 2016, they'll bring cars where there's infrastructure. So I don't think you want an order for 10 stations, right? In 2015, you want some longer term plan. What would you want to see so that it would be sustainable for your company, so that being publicly traded, you can go to your boss and it's okay. What do you need? Top 3 things. So we can give some action items to some of the folks here.
Yeah, you said Mark, you meant Mike, right?
Well, Mark said
okay, so
what we had to do, but you please start.
Yeah. So thanks. The number one thing is consistency from government, right? So this kind of here today, gone tomorrow approach is really difficult when talking to boards of directors or senior management about trying to justify spending money on a program that you know is going to lose money today, that will hopefully be a big growth area in the future. I mean, we've all betting on the come here. I have to stand in front of our president and justify spending money on stations that I know are going to lose money. So it's difficult when you have mixed messages. So that's number 1. Number 2 is, from our perspective, there's a little bit of this codes and standards issue. Whether this can be driven on a national level, whether it has to be state or even local, but it's really a difficult issue to continue to tackle kind of one-off each time. If there could be more kind of leadership on a national level driving, I'll give you just one example, is in Germany, the when you put a liquid hydrogen station in, so a delivered liquid, which is kind of predominantly the way hydrogen is delivered in the US today. There are exceptions to that, of course. But if you did that in Germany, the setback distance for a station from openings would be 30 feet roughly. In the US, it's 75 feet. It's a huge difference when you're trying to put a station into a forecourt, a retail forecourt that's 150 feet by 150 feet, 100 feet by 100 feet. It's really difficult to find a site where that fits. That's a significant hurdle. It could be addressed today under our kind of current methods. That's going to take 5 years to address. So could you speed that up somehow? And then, maybe, so you asked for 3 things. Yeah, so consistent funding. I guess maybe the third thing from our standpoint is just funding in general. I mean, it takes money to get these things out, and we can't justify putting them in today given the throughput. So either the funding or guaranteed throughput is really what's needed.
Just picking up on the codes and standards thing, I've been involved with the NFPA 2 activity, which is extracted code from NFPA 55 to do all the hydrogen stuff coming together. It's really been a laudable effort and really exciting to see the cross-industry work on trying to present that as an example. I've seen in other workshops where the advice is to start early, and I know we all try to do that, and to educate the AHJs and those folks along with what's coming and what to expect. On our side, maybe we've got a little bit easier because the quantity of hydrogen we're citing is lower, smaller, so it should be easier to do it. Yet, working with the codes quite a bit, I see quite a lot of room for hope in how it's being structured. A lot of the recent work that has been funded through national labs to address reducing those clearance distances, I think is encouraging. And we just need to continue to beat on those 2 areas. Continue to support the code development activity, continue to support the outreach and education activity at even starting at the municipal level and going on up, so that we educate people that this is a good thing, and it's a simple thing. It can be a simple thing to deploy in your neighborhood, and it's probably better than some of the stuff you've got there already.
Does anyone else want a piece of that before I take another question? Mark, and then why don't we take another question?
So I think I can do three pretty simple ones. I think from government, and this is government at all levels, federal, state, municipal government, I think the messaging is really important to say hydrogen fits into our energy goals. Even if we don't have an energy policy, we have goals for greenhouse gases, petroleum, reducing petroleum imports. This is how it fits in, and this is the place that it has. So that message is really powerful. We know that consumers don't go out and do those calculations themselves. And we can put out hundreds of reports. It doesn't matter. That messaging is really important. The other thing is really coordination at the regional level. Meetings like this, activities like this, it can be done really poorly if that coordination doesn't happen. So that has to happen. I think on subsidies, one type of subsidy or funding that is important is per kilogram of hydrogen dispensed. That has to be a signal to producers to get the market to it.
Mark, thanks. Let me move on to some questions from the audience. Right there, sir, please.
This intrigues me from the standpoint that we're waiting for the federal government to create some sort of standards, and there might be something to be learned by CARB, and which was put into effect by Ronald Reagan. It was essentially it's governing the large number of states, but it's become the U.S. model. And there might be an opportunity here to solicit one of our governors in the Northeast to take the lead on helping, using your knowledge to initiate a standard, which then can be adopted across the United States. So it might be just, given we're here in Albany, it could be, soliciting the support of the governor in Albany to help create a standard based from NYSERDA, Nanotech, your groups, and create a standard. You know, if there is no standard, create one and see what happens.
And any remarks on that creation of standards? I think that's remarkable. You go on. Any quick remarks?
So I guess were you saying a standard for implementation, a vehicle standard? Yeah, so like, you know, California requirements. I mean, you know, we could do it, and just understanding it, it's going to add cost for the consumer, and they have to vote for that governor maybe next time. And, you know, that's...
Why does it have to add cost? Maybe it can reduce cost.
Well, under currently it would add. I mean, then eventually, if we get our volume going up by a zero in order of magnitude, and then it can reduce cost. But today it would add cost. So, you know, the political will to do that, you know, it takes a strong leader who's not worried about re-election to do that. I don't even know if we're in the first term or the second term or what. I think it's a 1 6-year term, right? Is that what happens in
Yeah, but who would have thought that Ronald Reagan would have been like the leader of air quality? You know?
Who would have thought it?
Yeah.
But
I mean,
you know,
but
that's
it
why
makes
it
sense.
doesn't
It makes
happen.
sense. You know?
It adds cost.
All right, let me take one more question. You, sir.
Yeah, the people in this meeting today and in the panel are trying to get alternate fuel to be widely used in transportation. And we're all being held back by infrastructure. So, well, I would wonder if you looked at the model that's being used by the people who want to put CNG and LNG as alternate transportation fuel. And what they've got, for example, they have one company that's taking the lead, Clean Energy, is building infrastructure first locally that they've done for food trucks and so on, and now a national highway of fueling stations. And what they did was they found out who will benefit most from that. For example, Chesapeake Energy would benefit a lot from that. So they benefit. Chesapeake Energy gave Clean Fuels $100 million. Go ahead and start building this because they'll be the net benefit of people using their natural gas to drive their vehicle. So I wonder if there's enough people in this industry who want to use fuel cells that can fund as a group the infrastructure that you'll need. I mean, some of the people in the earlier panel talked about you start as a local area, and so you can put fueling stations and cars there. But still, as we pointed out, the consumers still look around and say, suppose they have that in the capital district area, but I want to drive up to the Adirondacks. So I can't use that car because no one put the fueling station up in the Adirondacks. So you have to be able to figure out how do you get from that each, if there were 100 of these local networks around different metropolitan areas, how do you finally get it so people can drive somewhere else? And that's the model that the natural gas people use.
We're running out of time, but quick answers. Have you looked at that model?
One answer is that the natural gas replacement for diesel is profitable today. There's a business case for it today. That's why it's happening. So, you know, they're doing it not because they're altruistic, but because they're saving money by switching to natural gas. And you don't need a whole new vehicle. You can just do a fit kit on the engine. It's lower cost, and you know. So, but you're right. That's what'll then provide the infrastructure for you know, consumer vehicles in the future. So they're getting started because it's profitable today.
I mean, this cooperation you talk about. I mean, so we've done this in Germany with Daimler, and we're putting 20 stations in together. So this kind of cooperative approach, and you know, we're both going to put those stations in and lose a little bit of money, but hopefully have that cooperation. You know, I think that I tell you, age to mobility and what's going on there is an example that we can learn from here in the U.S. I think.
All right, let me quickly answer from the Northeast Electrochemical Energy Storage Cluster. We have looked at that model, and that is one of the models that we've looked at. In fact, we've taken a look at all those compressed natural gas and a few as they are the liquefied natural gas facilities. So we are looking at that as a deployment model. Let me do this. Let me thank our panel. I'd ask you to join me and also suggest, I'm hoping, I'm thinking most of you will be around, so if folks have additional questions, ask away during lunch. But thanks very much.
Nuvera, NYSERDA, Plug Power, Raymond, and UTC Power. We'll just go down the row here very quick. We'll start with Lisa. Maybe tell us a little bit about UTC Power and the activities that you guys are involved with.
Okay. Hi, I'm Lisa Ward. I lead all of our government business development at UTC Power. So my goal really at the company is to educate different states at the legislative and the regulatory level to help promote changes and increased adoption, essentially, of stationary fuel cell technologies as a key component to distributed generation, to the landscape of distributed generation throughout the U.S. and worldwide, hopefully. Assemblyman Morelli, I wanted to thank him for giving my company a shout out earlier today when he talked about the Apollo space mission. That was actually our fuel cell. We've been in the fuel cell business and in the fuel cell industry since the 1950s, and that was our first fuel cell product. We had a fuel cell in every manned Apollo space mission. Our current landscape is actually both stationary and transportation, so I'd like to thank Michael at Lindy for bringing up the fleet vehicle idea. We have 4 fuel cell buses in Hartford, Connecticut, and 12 more out in California, I believe, using that fueling station. And right now, as far as New York is concerned, we actually have several installations within the state, and we have over 300 stationary installations. We have a 200 kilowatt product and a 400 kilowatt product. We've put in over 300 worldwide, and many of them in New York were through the help of NYSERDA, through NYSERDA funding programs here in the state. And just to give you some examples of kind of where we've been in New York, we have a current installation going in at RIT in Rochester. We have a mixed-use building in Roosevelt Island in Manhattan with a fuel cell, a news building in Manhattan, a hotel in Manhattan. We actually, the first fuel cell that we installed of our 400 kilowatt unit is here outside of Albany in Colony at a grocery store, Price Chopper. And it's actually kind of fitting to bring up today. We actually are also installing 12 units, 4.8 megawatts at the new Freedom Tower installation. So 3 of our fuel cells will be in each building going up at the World Trade Center site. So that's kind of where we are today, and my point really being on the stationary side that fuel cell technology is here, and it's definitely commercially viable. So.
Frank?
Hi, I'm Frank Womack of Fuel Cell Energy. I'm our Vice President of Government Business, and my responsibilities include all of our interface with the federal government, state and federal regulatory policy, and just general business development across the board. We manufacture stationary fuel cells, ranging in size from about 300 kilowatts to 3 megawatts. We've been deploying fuel cells since around 2003. We currently have over 50 installations around the world and about 90 megawatts of installed base. Our largest system is an 11 megawatt power plant in South Korea, and most of the facilities that we have are ranging around about a megawatt in size these days as the scale of our systems go up. Our technology falls really into 2 categories of deployment. One is distributed generation, combined heat and power, serving universities, hospitals, industrial facilities. And the second area is what we call grid support, where we've got utilities deploying fuel cells to directly support the grid. Almost all of our units in South Korea are in a grid support mode. The third area is rather interesting. Greg Moreland talked a little bit this morning about our unit in Orange County, California, which combines many of the attributes being talked about today in this forum: stationary power generation as well as production of hydrogen. That particular unit produces about 250 kilowatts of power and has the capability of producing about 250 pounds a day of hydrogen. And what is unique about that is that it allows for the production of electricity while we deal with the growth in vehicles, so we can produce power, and as you get more and more vehicles coming in for refueling, you can shift over to producing hydrogen for those systems. We'll talk more about that in the Q&A. Right?
Right.
My name's Craig Curtis. I work for Raymond Corporation. I'm product manager there. One of the things that I do is try to anticipate what the customer's needs are going to be in the future. And fuel cells come into that area. So we work with fuel cell companies, testing basically 5 things: the size, the weight, the center of gravity, power in, power out, to assure that the fuel cell and our forklifts, they're electric forklifts, of course, are compatible. We have several fuel cells working in our factory. They've been working there since 2007. The value proposition to the customer is very important. But firstly, it seems like a lot of our customers today, they want to be known for leading in the green area with food distribution companies, manufacturers. So we want to stay current with them. Looking forward to the future, we've done some development with some other companies trying to create a fuel cell machine where the fuel cell was incorporated into the forklift rather than a removable component. And the things that our customers really like about the operation of fuel cells is there's no power droop during the course of a shift. It runs the whole shift without any lower voltage like a lead acid battery. The other thing is the refueling time. You're talking about 3.5 minutes versus several times that you move and replace a battery. You don't have the potential for dropping a 2,500-pound battery. So these are very interested to our types of users who look at productivity.
Okay. All right.
Hi, my name is Eric Hansen. I'm the Vice President of Sales for Plug Power. I'm also responsible for hydrogen implementation at my customer sites. Plug Power has been working in the fuel cell industry for about 12, 13 years now. We've been in all different aspects of fuel cell technology and applications. A couple of years ago, we decided to narrow our focus down to a single market segment, and that's the industrial lift truck market. We came to the easy conclusion, really, that the only way you can make a fuel cell economically viable is by having a cluster in one location where you can fully utilize the hydrogen infrastructure over a large number of operating vehicles. So rather than go after the automotive market, which was already being handled by the automotive OEMs, we really focused our engineering on the industrial lift truck market. And we're working with Raymond on several sites in the United States. As Adrian had said earlier today, we have 37 distribution centers today that are fully converted. By the end of the year, we should have over 4,000 units in revenue-generating service. As Craig had mentioned, customers are interested in the green aspect of hydrogen use at their distribution centers. And usually that's the first key that they give me a call. They want to know about how green can this be, what carbon savings can we see. But at the end of the day, it has to pay for itself. None of them are interested in this because of carbon savings. It has to have a payback. And as Craig mentioned, a lead acid battery can take anywhere from 10, 15, 20 minutes to change, 2 to 3 minutes to fuel with hydrogen. And that is the productivity gain and the cost savings that our customers see. Because these are clusters, we start off with having anywhere from 100 to 400 lift trucks on day one fully utilizing that hydrogen infrastructure. To make that infrastructure capable of also supplying additional capacity to the roadside, to vehicles, is really a simple task. And that's why we see a strong correlation between our customer sites and getting publicly available hydrogen to the transportation market.
John?
My name is John Love with NYSERDA. We're located right here in Albany, but we have a couple of satellite offices, one in Buffalo, New York, and one down in New York City. We're a public benefit corporation. We derive most of our funding through the electric ratepayers in New York State, a charge on their electric bill, and we use that funding to advance energy efficiency related programs. We're not not specifically a fuel cell focused company, but we do have a lot of experience in the fuel cell industry. Mark, when he kicked off, mentioned that we have been funding fuel cell related technologies for quite a while, probably starting with a couple of companies, local companies here in New York, and expanding to others, Plug Power and MTI being the initial ones. But we do have a lot of experience in working with other hydrogen and fuel cell related companies in New York. We don't discriminate. We do fund fuel cell technologies outside of New York State. I think we've had funding involvement with all of the panelists here at the table. As Lisa mentioned, you could probably walk. It's not too far to Colony, to the Price Chopper supermarket, and see the fuel cell that's operating there. I have been there on occasion, just driving behind the building and watching the installation.
Yep.
So I did see that going on. But NYSERDA has a number of programs. I'm from the R&D department, which does most of the fuel cell activities, but we do have an energy analysis program that has input into documents such as the state energy plan. We have a residential energy affordability program looking, for example, at low-income housing and the energy requirements there. We also have an energy efficiency services group that looks at the deployment of energy efficient products and practices. But in the R&D group, we do have a number of different programs, not specifically, I would say, for hydrogen, not specifically for fuel cells, but that incorporate fuel cells and funding. Over the years, we've had product development type activities looking at the development of fuel cell technologies. We've been involved with demonstration activities for, and this is both on the stationary and the automotive market, and now we're also involved with deployment of commercial fuel cells. We have several solicitations that are out on the street right now that do offer funding for deployment of commercially available technologies. Those are PON 2157 and PON 2589. I'm sure a number of folks here are knowledgeable about. But the other thing that we do is, through all of this activity, we have, I think, done a very good job of learning a lot from the projects that we've been in, and then offering up that information for further development. Another thing that we do, we call it tech transfer. The other thing that we do is, and I think we do well, is get involved with what's going on in the industry, knowing what's going on in the industry, and being able to provide a little funding to support activities such as this, where we're getting some, I think, incredible talent from across the industry, from the fuel cell manufacturers to the fuel suppliers, and being able to get them all in one room, provide that information, and then keep the dialogue going.
Thank you. So let me start the discussion session with one question, and just as a clarification, I'm not expecting every single panelist to answer the questions. If one or two can answer the question, we can move on to additional questions, and maybe we can cover more questions that way if possible. We do have a diverse set of panelists here from sort of different sectors. So the question I have is, I mean, we've talked about, we've heard from the other panelists earlier about, the infrastructure versus the actual application versus for the cars, and I think, it's going to be very different from the stationary or the forklift standpoint, or it might be similar. So what I want to understand is, from a short-term perspective and a long-term perspective, if we look at the markets, you already have demonstration projects that have been out there for long periods of time, and actual commercial products that you're looking at selling in the marketplace today. What are the additional market segments that you think are in the short term will really exponentially grow your business in the short term, as well as, let's say, 5 years time period? And what are the key barriers? What is halting the market from actually really taking off in terms of the areas that you thought you should be focused in on and concentrating, and why hasn't it happened yet? Anybody?
Want to take a shot?
Go ahead, Frank.
Well, my vantage point is obviously stationary power generation. And we have units that are really already commercial, so it's not a question of infrastructure. We operate on natural gas, biofuels, and the growth in our marketplace really is attributable to more customer adoption, cost reduction, and frankly, governmental policies that want to drive movement from traditional power generation of natural gas combined cycle coal plants, and also try to expand the definitions of what we might consider to be clean energy technologies. And the growth in our business is not just about one particular market segment, like what would hospitals do to adopt, or what would universities do to adopt technologies, but more broadly trying to somewhat levelize the playing field, where fuel cells get credit for the clean attributes, some of the site-specific attributes, and build kind of a deployment pipeline across all applications.
So the number one thing you would say is policy, government policy?
Policy and volume.
Okay.
Policy and volume.
Where volume comes from policy, apparently, right? Okay. Anybody else? Yeah?
Yeah, I would agree with Frank. I think that policy at the government level would definitely drive volume at the state level, and I think that that would help bring costs down.
Okay, what about on the forklift side? Policy is not probably the driver, I don't think.
Well, for us, policy is not necessarily the problem.
Okay.
It is strictly a volume problem. Even with 150 lift trucks, let's say, at a distribution center, filling 2 to 3 times a day, you're at 700 to 1,000 fills a day. So you're equivalent to a gas station filling 1,000 cars a day. Our customer base still finds hydrogen costs to be excessive. It's very difficult to get a good economic payback. So how do we fix that? We should look at other products, other ways to use that same hydrogen so that we can utilize that common infrastructure across more kilograms of hydrogen. So we're looking at products like the drayage truck that Greg Moreland brought up earlier today. That's a good product. It uses a lot of hydrogen. It's a captured fleet. They stay within the compound of the distribution center. That would certainly drive volumes up considerably. The best next product that I think we're focused on is refrigerated trucks. So today they're using diesel fuel. They generate a lot of carbon dioxide, but again, it's a captured fleet. They come back to the same distribution center where our forklift fleets were operating, and these refrigerated trucks will use anywhere from 8 to 10 kilograms a day. So at one distribution center, you might have 200 to 400 refrigerated trucks using 8 kilograms a day. Imagine the volume that's generated just from that side alone. That would drive the molecule costs down, where the economic value proposition is really a no-brainer.
And just from NYSERDA side, I think we can help in the volume issue, and that we can help to buy down some of the cost of installing the unit, but not just in that application, but then by advertising the technology, by showing off, and by using some of these demonstrations of deployments as a showcase, which then spurs thought.
Okay. So do you get a sense that I mean, let's talk in terms of actual volume of sales, whether it's in the U.S. or abroad. Are there specific market segments abroad that are more amenable to deploying fuel cells, both from a forklift application standpoint or stationary application standpoint, where you've seen the example of actually policy implementations and or the volume examples that you gave for forklifts to actually work really well, that you would want to maybe highlight and consider as examples of something we should be doing here?
I'll take that initially. So I think that, and Frank actually mentioned their installation in South Korea. I think that something that's happening in South Korea that we've noticed, we also have a large installation over there, is that they have policy backing their renewable portfolio standard goals there, and the utility companies are having to pay large amounts of dollars if they're not installing a certain amount of renewable energy by a certain period of time. So I think that a lot of states domestically have adopted good renewable portfolio standards, and some are moving towards effective policy to implement those standards, but not enough of them are being strong enough with the policy behind it. So that's my take on international versus domestic.
I'll take a slightly different slant on that. I think policies that get developed are driven either by two directions. One is macro issues that go on, or societal desires. And what we're seeing, I think for stationary fuel cell power, we're beginning to see some changes in the way both the combination of societal factors as well as macro issues are coming into play worldwide. You have, from a macro standpoint, worldwide, at least in Europe and the US, an emergence of natural gas as a fuel that didn't quite get as much attention from a cost standpoint as it did 3, 4, 5 years ago. And that's happening even in Europe, where there's more shale gas being produced. At the same time that you've got other factors, such as Germany shutting down its nuclear operations. So now you have this situation where distributed generation, replacement power is beginning to get looked at in terms of other societal issues of wanting more sustainable clean power at a low cost. So the policies that we're operating under in Korea, for example, that Lisa mentioned, apply to fuel cell energy as well as UTC and other fuel cell companies, are driven by their desire to see more clean deployment, use high efficiency technologies for natural gas. And so the marketplace gets set by those big macro issues, and then it just trickles down to each application. In our case, grid support in Korea, but it really doesn't matter whether that policy drives adoption at a hospital or medical center or apartment building. It's the bigger factors, and we're seeing that in Europe as well, where particularly Germany and the European Union countries are looking at their past deployments in solar technologies, their future energy needs, and revisiting the question of fuel cell technology that provides clean, localized power, and then with the same kind of trickle down of applications from that bigger policy driver.
Can we talk about that in terms of the forklift market at all? I mean, is there a bigger initiative in foreign countries than in the U.S. at all, or is it any differences you see there?
I'm not real knowledgeable in the political aspects of it, I guess, but there's anecdotal evidence that in some of the European countries you have higher labor costs and also higher energy costs. So that helps to justify the fuel cell and forklift, give you a better return on investment.
How about some questions from the audience? Open it up. Yes, go ahead.
Sam Sterling, Verity LLC. Lisa, as well as Frank, you guys have both touched on the necessity of better policy. What do you think is the single best regulatory instrument to drive a more broad market hydrogen economy? I mean, every panel has kind of talked about some of the better markets for hydrogen, Germany, Japan, even California, and they have a better regulatory environment.
So this is the single most important thing from a policy perspective that you
think will?
Yep.
Yeah.
At the regulatory level?
Yes.
So say carbon tax, gas tax, better or more stringent RPS.
I think at the regulatory level, what we have found as a stationary fuel cell company as a huge hurdle is utility adoption of wanting to install distributed generation, whether they're required to by the RPS or not. So I think that interconnection, if you want to get down at that level, has been a huge hurdle in general for not just fuel cells, but distributed generation as a whole industry. That's been a difficult one to overcome. Some utilities have embraced the idea of distributed generation and some have not.
I think that falls into a category of clean energy standard. Now, what I mean by that is if you just look empirically at both states and governments that have adopted fuel cell technology, California, New York, here, New Jersey, Connecticut, as well as in Korea, what they have recognized is that in addition to the renewable technologies that they want to see deployed, they've broadened the horizons to include the next best grouping of technologies. And when you take that narrow band, broader than just pure renewable, but narrow enough to avoid everything being considered clean and innovative and new, you realize that fuel cells are a really good complement to maybe the core societal drivers of wanting renewable energy. And all of the states that I mentioned have had those kind of, I'll say, forward-thinking views, as well as the example of Korea. And if the United States had developed somewhat of I won't say a narrow view, but a focused view of what we really wanted in the form of clean energy deployment going forward beyond just simply renewables, you'd see those factors of a clean energy standard trickling into more adoption of fuel cell technologies, and not simply just power generation technologies, but also technologies where the fuel cell is used in automotives, where you're wanting to produce hydrogen from existing resources. So the clean energy standard is probably the biggest driver.
So Frank, just to understand your response there, I mean, so you're saying that New York and Connecticut and California are doing enough for deployment of fuel cells. It's the other states that you'd like to see doing more? Did I understand what you said?
Well, I'm saying I've never said. But what those states have are policies and definitions of what they consider to be their clean, renewable technologies, and they include whether fuel cells on a natural gas fuel are considered part of the portfolio, or whether there are just parallel policies that want to drive the adoption of fuel cells. Those states have got programs, mechanisms, and sort of societal policy drivers that say we want to deploy these technologies more so than other traditional technologies.
To follow on that, do you think there is a current framework, or what do you think would be a framework for businesses like ourselves to, really get to government and say, this is what we need to do in order to benefit this specifically on fuel cells?
I think there's a framework that exists. The challenge that this particular industry, and collectively I mean hydrogen fuel cells, is critical mass and size. You're competing with a very large space for energy issues in the United States, as an example. And while the fuel cell and hydrogen community is, I believe, really well respected at policy levels in Washington State, it's still a rather small voice compared to everybody else who's screaming for attention.
Yes, go ahead.
Gregor Solich, JP Research. How do you see the role of stationary fuel cells in the global problem of energy storage coupled to renewables?
So let me repeat the question for others. So how do you see the role of fuel cells as it compares to energy storage?
As a component of energy storage.
As a component of energy storage globally. That's the question. So how does it relate to each other? Right.
That's actually something that we are just starting to consider as part of our solution. I think that it should be part of the mix. I think that you can use other types of renewable technologies and advanced energy storage systems in conjunction with stationary products in order to create an overall better solution or energy solution at the global level. So I would say that yes, it's part of the mix, but it's not something, at least that we've started to consider at the commercial level yet.
I think the answer that I would give to that is going back to hydrogen as a universal carrier and an energy medium. And if you look at hydrogen as being something that all fuel cells utilize, and quite frankly, fuel cells produce. In our case, our reforming process produces more hydrogen than we need. That's what we do in California with our tri-generation system. We produce that hydrogen for vehicle refueling. Now, there's only got 30 cars a day potential. There's only one car that's actually using the refueling, so we're making power. But the point is that the system, if you look at a fuel cell and the various fuel uses, and you put storage into that equation, there is no reason that you can't store the hydrogen for use in in our case, there's an application where you can take a PEM fuel cell, for example, store the hydrogen if you're not putting it into a vehicle for forklifts or other transportation use, and you can simply just put it back through a PEM fuel cell and make electricity with that hydrogen and have a multifaceted system that produces power and electricity and as a peaking system, storage system. getting the electricity world to think outside of just battery-based electrochemical storage and recognizing that hydrogen is a very flexible and fungible storage medium is a bit of a policy challenge. But our systems can produce a 2.4 megawatt system, for example, could produce 2.4 megawatts of peak power for 8 hours of duration. So the storage is inherently there, and that ability to use that hydrogen stored for power or otherwise cuts across transportation use, power generation. So it's viable.
Go ahead.
I'd like to ask questions in continuation of, this is the Northeast Forum, and there's a coalition of Northeast governors. I think there's an opportunity for hydrogen group and stationary fuel cell group to work through the governors association. And I think this is a very important part. It provides solution for many things: stationary power, peak power, fuel cell cars, as well as we can provide charging for electric cars. And you use waste biomass. So there's like 5, 6 areas you are connecting. Can we consider connecting with the coalition of Northeast Governors Connect? And how do we connect that message?
Good question. So for the government affairs folks on the panel, that's a good question. Can it be done? Can we make a case? Is one part of the question. Second case is what is being done already, or why aren't we doing anything yet?
As far as stationary fuel cells are concerned, actually, because we're a transportation fuel cell company as well. In Connecticut, at least, in conjunction with Frank and other not fuel cell company OEMs, but other infrastructure and hydrogen companies as well. We've done some successful legislative briefings on the industry and what kinds of policies can help drive the changes that we need and how is everything integrated together. That type of educational session, we've done that in Connecticut and we're going to do it in California. I think that at the legislative level we're there. I'm not sure if I'm sure it's possible, but I don't know how, the direct path to get to the governor level to give the same message.
So is it hard to try and get all the governors in the Northeast to get together to say, this is what we're going to do, this is our vision? I mean, that's basically what we're trying to do on the transportation side to some extent, and maybe combine it with stationary and something else is basically the question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, the coalition exists,
yeah.
And they have worked on bioenergy area. The question is this group, and Joe Reinbold and Pradeep yourself, can you create momentum to be on governor's agenda for the next meeting? That's a very straightforward question.
Well, and I think we need to take advantage of, if you were here early, you heard Assemblyman Joe Morelli and his comments, and I think that they're right in line with that. That is in fact what he's trying to do. And you know, through the activities and the formation of the working groups that we have here, and showing the momentum, the interest, the drive to get on there. I think that's we gotta keep on that effort and get Joe to help us open the door to
And I would add, this forum is the first step in trying to pull all that together as well. So hopefully we will move that forward. Yes.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
I think there's also another group that's missing from the discussion. And when you talk about fuel cells for stationary power, and that's the utilities. The utilities are enormously stressed with the growth and demand for power. And in California, where I'm from, you've got peak power penalties, businesses are struggling with energy management. And the utilities have to make investments to live up with the growth. But when you put a renewable energy standard against them, rather than them having to comply directly, they can leave that up to the customers with stationary power. And then they would look at these type of products and companies as help instead of competition, or just not looking at them at all. And I think if you bring them into the discussion, things would move a little faster. And utilities are all mixed bag, I understand.
It's probably easier to bring all the governors together. I mean, utilities are really, not to be offensive to any utilities, but they are followers. They are driven by large trends, what the regulators decide they want to do, and their own needs to provide stable, reliable power within the business model they've got. So getting utilities to be the ones that want to collectively drive new trends is a challenge that's gone in this country for
I'm not saying they drive. I don't see any leadership in that, but they can be the balancing hook. It's kind of a paradigm shift, where instead of you relying on the utility for your power primarily, you rely on yourself as a business or warehouse, and you use the utility for backup power, for evening power, for needs. Our campus in California is powered by itself, by natural gas, by an engine, by a fuel cell. California's had all kinds of power problems in the past couple of years. So we look at the utility as kind of a backup. And maybe they need to embrace a different role.
I think that, just to comment quickly, I think that statement as them being backup power, I think that's one of the pushbacks from them, because as you install distributed generation, you are taking profit away from the utility. So it's a very careful.
Yeah, but in a sense, they're guaranteed their profits. They run back to their regulatory commissions and restructure their plans. So maybe you pay a lot more in the future, but it's just backup power. You don't use that much.
Well, so let me sort of, the utilities themselves are really not the decision makers, but we'll find out. It's the service commissions, the public service commissions that tell the utilities what to do. And the biggest problem is the reason why the public service commissions do not tell the utilities to embrace distributed generation that includes fuel cells or solar or some of the other distributed generation applications is also the impact to the ratepayer. I mean, they are told by the governors and the legislators that you can do what you want in terms of embracing renewable, but I don't want you to increase any of the ratepayer prices. So this brings me to the question of cost. It boils down to how does fuel cells from a cost perspective, let's not evade the question, it is still expensive, like some of the other distributed generation technologies. Where do we stand in terms of the cost curves that we need to get to? And it's the same for the transportation applications too. You got to get the cost down to a level where people will start embracing the technology more. I mean, to some extent, you can prime the pump. We've talked about that in terms of, providing some demonstration projects and getting deployment to happen. But ultimately, nobody's going to stand for their rates going up significantly to embrace any of these technologies for that matter, right? Comments on that?
Was there a question in there?
I was waiting for it.
How do you address that? It is a market barrier.
It's a market barrier for all technologies, whether it's hydrogen transportation, putting engines in cars that are reliable and durable and really low cost, as well as stationary power generation. What I can say from our standpoint is that we continue to make progress in driving costs down, and our cost of our technology are probably on a levelized cost of energy basis 15 to 16 cents. That still isn't, it's less expensive than renewable technologies, but still not at a point where it is universally at the parity with what people pay for electric rates from their grid. So we have a gap problem, maybe not as large as other people have, but the gap problem exists. And I think that one piece of missing equation that the fuel cell and hydrogen industry has to work with is that the economic value generated by jobs and by energy intensity or by economic intensity is yet to be categorized by this industry in a way that policymakers will say, I'll pay that differential as I do for solar and wind and other technologies. And that's kind of a challenge that the industry has to take on, to acknowledge that, to get people to realize that you're very close and the future benefits of economic gain far outweigh the extra amount of money needed to get cost driven down to parity. And I'll just comment one more thing about this particular forum. When Joel and Pradeep, probably 2 years ago, when the idea of the electrochemical clusters was originating, I was intrigued by the definition and what was the composition going to be and why are we doing this, and the SBA backed funding for this. But what it really did, and what's seen here in this particular forum, is that it began to focus on the economic activity regionally that was already in place but not brought to the surface. And so I view this kind of forum as a starting point for saying, well, if you can put together more than just the environmental benefits or the power, electricity, why should utilities adopt, and begin to build the recognition that there is an economic value for the pieces of this industry coming together, you'll have a far better message for those governors and for people to want to pay that price premium. This is a starting point to build that economic base.
There's one last question here, I'll take that.
I'd like to respond to the gentleman's concern about getting the governors together. I think everybody except for the Californian in this room is part of the regional greenhouse gas initiative.
Yes, it already exists.
If you haven't had conversations with that group, they're doing a clean fuel standard right now. And hydrogen needs to be in the mix when they talk about clean fuels for this region. And you know, they've generated a lot of money for energy efficiency, and there's no reason why your fuel cells can't be part of that energy efficiency. You just need to convince the powers to be at that level that we've got a product here that will work and help the utilities. And you can get together all those governors because that groups get everyone together on a regional basis, on a regular basis. So I think.
So that was more of a comment than a question. You know, maybe another answer to that could be the federal government, and that's sort of a good segue into the Department of Energy. And Sanita is here, as I said earlier. She can come and talk. But let's thank the panelists real quick. And with that, I'll get Sunita to come up and make a few comments and maybe take some questions before we break for lunch.
Thank you, Pradeep. And first of all, despite waking up at before 4 o'clock in the morning and all of my ordeals with the travel here, I'm glad I finally made it. And I think this meeting is very important, so I did want to make the time to take the day and come here, and I look forward to further discussions afterwards. But first of all, I would like to thank Joel, Matt, Pradeep. I know there have been a lot of people behind the scenes who've been helping to prepare for this type of event, and Assemblyman Morelli and NYSERDA. So I think there are many players here. And even though I know I haven't personally come to this area for a while, I've been hearing a lot of good things about this group, and especially the Northeast. So I'd like to thank all of you who've been involved. And then secondly, unfortunately, Greg was here to give the overview. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them later. But I do want to reiterate that DOE is supportive of hydrogen and fuel cells. A lot of things have been changing. I think hopefully you've been seeing that, so I want to reiterate the positive message. I think now I really had mainly two messages, and then I'd be happy to take any questions. I think the first one is the importance of communication. So I think in general, and I'm sure many of the fuel cell developers and other advocates of fuel cells, we all tend to speak very well within the community, but then we still don't see as much communication outside the community. So there's still a perception, and we give talks all the time and have discussions outside the community, whether it's OMB, the Hill, other agencies, even the private sector. And so there's still a lot of pushback in terms of this industry, overpromised and underdelivered. You go back many years, there's this whole baggage in history, and the costs are still not there. We talked about cost parity and so forth. And so I think it's really important. There have been a lot of success stories just in the last couple of years, and I think Greg showed examples with the Recovery Act. We spent just in our program alone at DOE, and you saw the numbers, $1 billion just in the last few years. Budgets are really tight, so I think that's a reality for everybody. So I think that's one issue, but communication is so important. We showed with the 700 or so forklifts, fuel cell forklifts that we cost shared through the Recovery Act. We're tracking now more than 3,500 orders that hopefully you heard earlier in the day with the private sector, major companies, Wegmans, Coca-Cola, Whole Foods, FedEx, and these Cisco, they're putting in these fuel cell forklifts without DOE funding. So there's a lot of concern, obviously now with the fiscal situation with the government and spending and so forth. And so I think it's very important for, if the story's there, of course we don't want to, again, overhype anything, but if the story's there, I think it's important to communicate it. So I think that's the first takeaway. And then the second main point I wanted to make, and hopefully I can talk with people and meet people afterwards, and of course Greg is here, and Antonio Ruiz from our program as well, with Safety Codes and Standards, is here. But the second main point is what more can we do to help? So the fact is we have, our budget's about $100 million per year. We have, the budgets have been going down, but we still have almost 300 projects. We've done a lot in the safety codes and standards area behind the scenes, the setback distances and so forth, educated more than 23,000 code officials, first responders, and the education side as well. And I know many of you have been involved, more than 9,800 teachers.